What's up, fam? Smash the like button for the algorithm, and let's get started with the story. A child was born on Ardell territory, a little provincial estate in the midst of nowhere. The man was really concerned, yet he wanted a son. The elderly woman wrapped the infant and announced that the man's hopes and wishes had come true. The child resembled the landlord. The woman inquired whether the parents had already chosen a name for their boy. The baby's mother stated that they would name him Paul Arley. She hoped Paul would be the light of the world. The boy was ordinary as a child. While reading a book, he overheard a man tell another to get as much seafood as possible. The servant consented. Paul felt interested and called out to Uncle Frederick. The man asked him what he wanted. The youngster begged the man not to go to the street near the South Mountain because he had witnessed an unusual flow of manna there. Frederick was perplexed and did not know what to reply. He asked the boy's father what these phrases could possibly signify. His interlocutor didn't know what to say either. Thunderstorm. Frederick rushed into the building in the downpour. Gray was already waiting for him at the entryway, expressing concern over his tardiness. The man dashed into the building, confessing that he had taken a longer route and pleading for pardon. Gray wondered what had happened to his interlocutor. Frederick claimed that he had avoided difficulties just now because he had followed the advice of young Master Paul. Gray was perplexed and questioned what that could mean. The father reminded him of what the youngster had said yesterday about not walking through the streets of South Mountain. Only now had he discovered that there had been an attack by beastmen. Gray was astonished and shocked to learn about it. Frederick went on to claim that everyone who had been there was in terrible danger, but he was safe because of Paul. The interlocutor got contemplative. The man looked at the youngster and asked Gray if he believed Paul could smell manna in the air. The man admitted that he found it difficult to answer this question. He considered what would happen if that were true. If this were true, Paul would be Ardell's future. From that day forward, the boy shone a stronger gift for magic. He could detect manna when he was 6, and he could express it at the age of 7. When he turned 10, the man sincerely stated that he wanted to hand it over the floor to the first-year representative. He asked the audience to meet the boy. Paul had beaten off several students from affluent households to enter the Ignant Magic Academy, the greatest magic school in the Radiant Kingdom. The serious boy was regarded as the best among those entering the academy. He was registered as the best applicant and thus earned the title of genius. This attitude bothered Paul slightly, but he consoled himself with the thought that his name would elevate the family's standing. However, he was not particularly effective in this. The man urged the boy to show the best skills among the applicants. Paul sought to maintain his confidence. On the first day of courses, it was evident that he wasn't the best, not even second. A teacher requested that he release his energy as soon as possible, but the youngster was unable to focus and release sufficiently. Paul didn't comprehend what was going on or what he was doing wrong. All of the pupils looked at him with anxiety. He experienced a slight releasing condition. Paul noticed he lacked the intrinsic ability to cast magic, even a meter away from his body. For a mage, his body was the very worst. The others quickly discovered his lowly roots and lack of magical talent. As a result, their attitude toward the boy shifted dramatically. Paul nearly collapsed to the floor after being shoved by one of his peers. One boy asked another if he was all right. Paul remained silent, but the other went on to imply that his friend had just touched a crippled person and may also become one. That guy's companion joked that he needed to wash himself immediately to prevent this destiny. He was quickly labeled as someone who was incapable of wielding magic. He was labeled defective because he couldn't even cast spells at the Magic Academy. The jealous folks degraded his current status. The guy who pushed him inquired why he was staring at him like that. He swung his arm, claiming that he had no right to gaze at him because he was unable to do magic. His stares became the greatest joy that his jealous peers could ever have. Paul was infuriated. He struck the wall with his bare fists. The man couldn't catch his breath and came to his senses, understanding that everything was happening in fact. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to become a magician. Paul Arley was the man who joined the academy with the best marks, looked more promised than anyone else, and worked harder than everyone else. When it came to his curse, he quickly forgot all of his benefits. They claimed that the genius got crippled in magic. That's how everything ended. Paul was in despair. More specifically, it could have ended so tragically. He just assumed it all stopped there. However, Paul could not have imagined that in the depths of despair there would be room for a miracle. The notice stated that the player artifact was activated, the status window was unlocked, the player artifact has been activated. The guy kept falling down, unsure where he was. He now felt as if he were deep underwater. Something told him the guy was the incarnation of the World Destroyer. Paul had no idea what this meant. He didn't believe what he heard and wasn't sure what to think. The guy became terrified when a big figure emerged in front of him. Paul was speechless when he noticed a bizarre person with open crimson eyes. The person assumed it was a dream, but it was far too vivid for that. Looking closer, he noticed the figure opening its mouth and knew it was attempting to give him an instruction. A picture appeared in his eyes. He had been transported a few hours prior to this to the Ignat Academy's training grounds. This time, Paul was called next. The man stated that all he needed to do was make a fireball and hit the scarecrow with it. As previously indicated, Mike looked at him and thought it was an easy exercise that any student would be able to complete with flying colors. For someone who couldn't use magic, this was an almost impossible feat. Paul was desperate. He had no idea whether he'd be able to utilize it this time. Mike yelled at the guy and insisted that he begin immediately. He understood he shouldn't stay, since he might fail. Paul began concentrating on his hand, attempting to separate mana. He trusted in himself and wanted to complete this assignment at whatever cost. In one movement, he increased the concentration of mana in his hand. The individuals gathered around were astounded to see the size of this ball because the guy appeared to have a lot of mana in his body. Mike remained mute, waiting for the man to reveal himself. Paul had some faith in himself and decided that if all else remained constant, he would be able to complete this assignment. He became enraged when he realized he had been caught up in it again. His hand stopped leaking mana again, and the person had no idea what was going on. A second later, he coughed due to tiredness. Paul spit on the ground. Mike asked the individual to eventually show himself, but he appeared unable to do so. The man insisted that he remove it from his body as soon as possible. The guy stated that the fireball would not leave his hand and that he had no idea what to do with it. Mike kept pressuring the kid because he was already in his senior year and should have known such fundamentals. The man stated that if he could not do normal magic, such as a fireball, he would simply flunk the final exam. Mike raged at Paul, saying he was bound to fail. The child could not help but agree with him in his mind. He clenched his fist and apologized, claiming he would work harder in practice. In this practical shooting test, they had to make 10 fireballs and strike the target several times. Paul was unable to load even one whole ball into the target. The child recognized that he couldn't even expect to be a third-rate mage. The boys made fun of him, not understanding how he got into the academy with the highest grades. They continued pushing him to give up since, in their perspective, he was the biggest moron. The child was aware that the top performer in the entrance exams was the offspring of a provincial nobility. His colleagues from more prestigious households grew to envy and feel inferior to him, which was the primary basis for their enmity toward him. Paul realized he couldn't take their mockery forever. Reality, of course, stripped him of optimism and began to erode his psyche from within. This curse, the mana release issue, was the only thing holding him back for 6 years. Although Paul had held on successfully all along, he began to wonder how much longer he could hang on at this pace. In the academy's hallway, the boys were discussing how their exam went. Someone in the crowd noticed the person and yelled at everyone, calling him a fool. The folks who often picked on him suggested that he pack his belongings early. The man stated that if he were in Paul's position, he would be humiliated to even reveal himself in public. But Paul was more persistent. He inquired as to if his interlocutor was aware of what the younger ones nicknamed him. The guy said that everyone called him a dumbass according to the boys because of Paul. The seniors did not serve as role models. The boys requested that he return to his province as quickly as possible while laughing. Paul stayed mute. One of the youngsters stated that nature typically rewards either with skills or fortune, but that he had been unlucky in both. Another child claimed that his entire family consisted of pompous idiots who had never had anything. Before he could continue speaking, Paul lunged forward and punched him, throwing his fist as hard as could. He slammed it hard into his opponent's face. The other guy was stunned when he witnessed his pal thrown back several meters with a single punch. Paul was enraged and asked that his opponent repeat what he had said about his father. The man appeared to have misinterpreted his opponent's objectives and just called him names while wiping away blood. He didn't think a man from a modest background could do such a thing. Paul emphasized that you should know when to stop and know when to stop, he said. These guys had no right to talk about his family. The guy's companion dashed towards Paul to strike him back. He was surprised by his opponent's speed at the end, just before the blow. With one punch, Paul knocked out his opponent, who went to his knees and gripped his stomach. His opponent was outraged and watched him suffer. The opponent was taken aback and couldn't believe how much strength could be hidden in such a dud. The man with golden hair began using magic to exact revenge on his assailant. He maintained Paul had no right to touch him. The person simply didn't believe his opponent would utilize magic at the academy. The opponent persisted and released the sphere directly at Paul. He looked unconcerned about the possibility of being expelled for this. The opponent asked that he die. Paul realized he couldn't move. The teacher was already running toward them, demanding that they halt immediately. It was too late. Paul had touched the opponent's magic. He buried his face and had no idea what would come next. His death had most certainly arrived just as he had anticipated. He embodied the destroyer of worlds. The status window was opened, the player artifact was activated, and the man saw a gigantic figure with red flashing eyes in front of him. He had no idea what was happening to him or where he was. Paul had no idea what was happening. The large figure opened its mouth and called to him. It stated his complete name, and the youngster peered into its eyes, terrified. He would have been certain that it was indeed his name. Suddenly, the darkness began to recede, and he opened his eyes, hearing his name shouted out beneath his eyelids. When he opened them, Chloe emerged. The teacher was relieved that the kid had finally awoken. For a brief moment, Paul knew that everything that had happened to him was correct. He got up a little and asked where he was. Chloe tried to put him back down, stating he was in the break room and needed to relax. She continued stressing that the youngster needed to lie down and recover. Paul claimed that nothing bad had happened to him, he was simply dizzy. He didn't know if he had lost consciousness. The youngster had no idea what type of figure it was. It appeared extremely genuine to him in that dream. Paul inquired as to how long he had been resting in that position. The girl explained that she had been watching him here all day. She claimed it was a tremendous fortune that the guy got off with such few penalties. Paul questioned if he was all right now. Chloe stated that they needed to do a few more tests and that he looked very decent for someone who had been directly hit by a lightning ball. The girl stated that he had no wounds or burns and that his organs were intact. She claimed that she had never seen anything like this before. The guy had no idea how this was possible. He was aware that a lightning ball was a deadly enchantment that burned the body in seconds, and he had received a direct blow from one. Paul couldn't understand how he was fully fine after such an onslaught. The professor went inside the restroom and apologized for bothering him. Chloe stated that she would go evaluate the guy's test while the professor was looking after him. The girl asked not to remain silent if something bothered him. Mike approached the bed and inquired as to how his interlocutor was feeling. Paul said that he felt perfectly well. The man said that was excellent, but a whole professorial council was being assembled for the occasion. He guaranteed that his offenders would be expelled without fail. Mike explained the cause. According to him, he was expelled for utilizing combat magic with the aim to murder, as well as spreading false tales about the family's chief. He also acted rudely and bullied Paul. According to the man, all of the acts listed above were considered while reaching a decision. The guy lowered his head and admitted that he had also hit him. Mike stated that while he would be punished as well, given the circumstances, he would just be performing volunteer work for a month. Mike stated that he had one more question that he would like to know about. The man wanted to know if the individual had any artifacts. Paul was astonished to learn about. He stated that this was untrue, since if he had anything like that, he would not be intimidated by others around him. Mike began to ponder and concluded that, given the artifact's rarity and worth, the boy's family leader would have already used it for his people. Paul questioned why his interlocutor was even inquiring about this. The man hesitated but decided to respond. He was certain that a crimson light enveloped the boy's body before the lightning ball struck. It was as if a powerful item shielded Paul, reflecting the magic. The man didn't believe what he heard. He knew what an artifact was, but he couldn't believe it. Paul suddenly recognized that this could be connected to his bizarre dream. He responded that he had no idea what had happened to him and certainly did not have an artifact. Mike hesitantly agreed with him. The man went to the exit, instructing the youngster to relax. Had no notion what had transpired, and the professor did not inquire more. He was interested in what his interlocutor was thinking. Now, the guy reflected and understood that he had had an experience similar to a dream, as well as that strange voice calling to him. The voice stated that the artifact was open and accessible. It also mentioned a player. Paul remembered that the statue had mentioned something else, but he couldn't use his memories. He remembered a status window. Suddenly, the guy observed something directly in front of his face. Chloe was already approaching him with some papers in her hands. Paul understood it was real. The girl inquired as to his condition and whether he was feeling well. The man explained that it was not about his health, but about something he witnessed there in front of him. He informed Chloe about something blue. The girl had no idea what he was talking about because there was nothing there. She wasn't sure if the guy was sane. Paul couldn't believe she couldn't notice this window. The notification table had all of his information. The man knew that only him could see it. He decided to make up an excuse. First, Paul said that he must have squinted, but the girl replied it was not funny at all. According to her, the man's tests were normal and he could return to the dorm. Paul was pleased and thanked her. The guy recalled that today he had survived a lightning strike without incident. He had encountered a man with a red eye, entered an alternate universe, and received a status window that only he could see. The glass then revealed that he was the incarnation of Draw. The guy began to wonder if the Mage relic had been entrusted to him. Now another weird window emerged in front of his eyes. It was some kind of assignment. He had to develop his body to increase its strength. After reading the list, Paul knew that he needed to engage in physical activity. He didn't see how this could benefit a mage like him. Nonetheless, he had no doubts and decided to just attempt it. First, after hitting with one fist, he noticed that his strength improved. After hitting twice, the strength increased much more. Paul noticed the number was increasing, and at this rate, he would soon attain his goal. After another hit, the number remained constant, and he returned his gaze to the window. It appeared that the hit was not counted if there was even the tiniest error in execution. In this scenario, he opted to complete the training properly. It was night outside, and Paul was exhausted. Relieved that he had finally finished, sweat was running down his face. The window indicated that the work had been accomplished and that his strength had increased. Paul was taken aback when he heard about the reward. He detected something in himself. It was a peculiar feeling that was hardly perceptible. He felt it in his blood, and it wasn't just mana. He knew how he felt. The person had certainly grown stronger as a result of the training. He determined to put his strength to the test in real life. He smashed something in front of him with a single strike, and he noticed mana collecting around his hand. The person recognized that his strength and magic had increased significantly. The speed, air resistance, and strength felt entirely different. The fundamental has also grown, therefore there should be a second prize. The status window reappeared in front of his eyes. The next objective was to form a power circle. Paul read and knew he needed to replace the mana circles with power circles. He knew that after this, his mana will be replaced with physical strength. Everyone who studies mana has a circle around their heart. Mana is crucial in releasing and strengthening mana. The number of these circles increases with the mage's ability to control accumulated mana. The youngster possessed 4 mana circles, which is more than is typical for people his age. Nonetheless, due to his illness, they were equivalent to 0. Paul had a sudden realization. The mana rings in his heart were disappeared. The furiously circulating force took their place, and power circles emerged. Paul was shocked by the new sensation. Power circles replaced mana circles. Paul knew nothing about magicians who did not have mana circles, and he had no idea what would happen if he replaced all of his circles. The child reasoned that he could then abandon his life as a mage entirely. Still, it was too early to succumb to decadent impulses, and he should put them to the test. The boy chose to use a fireball. He was shocked at how quickly he could generate it in his hand. It was almost impossible. In his opinion, Paul sensed an unfathomable strength in his hand. The size of the fireball made the guy comprehend the artifact's power. Paul was given a unique opportunity since magic operates on a basic principle. It takes an average of 10 seconds to unleash. Due to his inherent strength, the person appeared to be able to skip this stage and create a fireball. He was certain that this was the power of the relic. After another training session, Paul noticed a window appear next to him. He had no idea what work to expect now. He had read and understood that he needed to fill his body with magic in order to attack, but he had no idea how to do it. The man figured Dre had a similar illness, so he fought by infusing his hands and legs with magic. Paul had no idea how he arrived. Following this strategy, the man saw that a new work had appeared for him. He was astonished to learn about it. He needed to strike the target. Paul had not even considered the physical force method yet. Until the very end, he didn't believe he could become a magician with its guidance. The man understood he still needed to discover his strength. He threw a fireball in a matter of seconds. Paul was relieved that it worked. The duty was accomplished, and the guy became stronger. He sat on the ground and chose to rest. Paul was ecstatic that he had finally completed the work. The guy reflected on how previously every failure occurred at the discharge stage. Finally, he conquered it and was able to really experience magic. The guy still couldn't believe that someone had devised such a system. He had no idea who this Draw was. Of course, Paul wanted to find out right away, but his body was becoming heavy. What surprising voices. Someone claimed that he appeared to have trained till sunrise and then fell asleep on the job. Paul had no idea what was going on, so the voices asked him to wake up. And the guy became conscious after hearing these sounds repeatedly. Someone stated that he was undoubtedly not dead because he survived the lightning strike. Paul couldn't understand why his brain was so noisy. The guys swarmed around him, shocked by his abrupt appearance. They implored him not to terrify them again. Paul rose from the ground and stretched, claiming that they were acting strangely, as if they had never seen a sleeping person on the street. The boys went silent. Some men commented that this was unusual for a nobleman who had entered a respected college. He inquired if Paul had been drinking. The guy sent them all away, claiming that he was simply exhausted and fell asleep on the spot. The boys were still perplexed. They discussed between themselves, noting Paul's unusual behavior. "My friend," one of the boys muttered, staring at the spot where the scarecrow used to be. He was startled to find no trace of the scarecrow. "Garoo!" He indicated that it could have been Paul. The guys didn't believe it and rejected it, claiming he didn't know how to use magic. The academy dormitory welcomed Paul as he entered the building. He was brushing his teeth and was shocked that the guy had only recently returned. Jason inquired whether anything had happened to the man, to which he replied that it was none of his business. Paul was aware that his interlocutor, although being the eldest son of a well-known family, was not antagonistic to him. Jason inquired in a cheeky tone whether the man had actually been with a girl at the time. He was a maniac obsessed with drink and ladies, which is why he was continually sneaking out of the academy grounds. Jason did not stop, claiming that the man had not even had time to be struck by lightning because he was immediately grasping his head. Paul tossed clothes in his face, claiming that he went to the bathroom and had no idea what he was talking about. He felt better now as he relaxed in the warm water. Suddenly, the person remembered that he had another responsibility that needed to be completed. He wanted to prepare his body through exercise. Paul was startled that the prizes remained constant, although the number of repeats had doubled. The guy wasn't sure if his progress would continue at this rate, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. He was willing to do anything to become a mage. 1 month had gone since then. It turned out that the repeating activity could be completed once every day, but unlike the constant reward, the number of repetitions required increased with each day. If the construction could not be finished within a day, all progress was lost. That's why Paul never missed a day of training, and the person noticed some gain from it. He was relieved that the requirements for completing the tasks did not exceed 3,000 repetitions, else he could simply die. The man ran up and jumped. For the previous month, he had been completing these training sessions every day. The person even learned a new skill, which made him quite thrilled when he read about its qualities. The boys had recently discussed Paul's unusual behavior. They couldn't figure out why he was sleeping during class, despite the fact that he kept his gaze fixed on the board. The other guy was upset that his interlocutor had only observed this. He stated that Paul had moved to the training ground and was now practicing kicks. One of the guys requested them to ignore him because he'd always been peculiar. The guys felt the individual was attempting to compensate for his illness in this manner, which, in their opinion, did not work. Thus, for the past month, Paul fulfilled tasks while looking for hints concerning Draw's identity. Still, the man couldn't identify a mage with that name in historical records. He gathered books one by one but discovered nothing. Paul only had one question for himself. Who was Draw? The guy was quite interested about who had given him such power. Someone called him from the side. Jason dashed in and inquired whether his interlocutor had heard any news. Paul didn't understand what had happened. The individual assumed that because he was calmly reading books, he knew nothing. Paul was unsure whether something severe had occurred and inquired about it. Jason said the leader of the Ardell family had arrived at the academy. This caught the boy completely off guard. His interlocutor shocked him again with the news that his father had arrived here. Paul rushed to the exit. He hurried down the corridor, shouting for his father. The man on the side was chatting, and the father turned to face his son. He was quite pleased to meet him. They had planned some time to discuss. Paul inquired about his father's well-being, noting that he had been sent to this academy 6 years prior. The man replied that he was doing okay, as usual. The child inquired about his sister's well-being. Ray stated that she had matured into an adult and had begun to study swordsmanship. According to him, the sister sought to protect her weaker brother. Paul scratched the back of his head and admitted that he felt embarrassed after hearing about it. Ray claimed that the girl had always been self-confident. Paul turned to his father and remained silent for a moment. He mentioned that he was doing fine. Gray, perplexed by these statements, inquired once again. The youngster stated that he was perfectly okay and that no one was assaulting him physically or mentally. The father drank a cup of tea and considered it. Gray admitted that he had come here to find out whether the boy wanted to quit the academy. The man intended to communicate the sense that if he was having a difficult time, the house's doors were always open. He wanted to know what challenges his son had encountered during this period. The boy thought about it. Paul stated that he would be open and honest in this chat, telling him that he had been mistreated from the start. He rushed to impress his father by claiming that he appeared to have found a way out of the predicament. The boy urged they reach an arrangement straight away. He stated that a practical test was coming up and that he was expected to perform well. Paul stated that if he failed the test, he would do as his father wished. The child pledged that he would do well in the practical exam, and his father recognized his commitment and returned to the estate. The long-awaited exam day finally arrived. Everyone's attention was pulled to the start of the written exam on comprehending magic, which was announced. The lads were informed that any violations would result in the results being reset. They could begin working, and the boy grabbed the pen. The examination is broken into 2 parts, written and practical. The practical element is further divided into 4 sections: aim shooting, measuring magical strength, real battle, and one-on-one combat. Paul aced the written exam despite having a disorder of magical release. Throughout the training time, in the practical portion, another guy from an authoritative household consistently took first place. Paul felt confident that this time would be different. He felt that this year he deserved first place. After finishing the written portion and several days of study, it was time for the practical exam. Jason called Paul out. He didn't understand why his interlocutor had been acting strangely recently. He was quite curious if Paul had any plans for the practical aspect. The person explained that he was only trying out a fresh technique to magic. Jason was pleased and inquired what he was going to do about it. Jake interrupted the guy's chat because he was curious in what Paul was doing there. The guy laughed as he announced his intention to take the exam. Jake claimed that it was unhelpful for his problem. Paul stated that he came just to take the exam, thus he saw nothing wrong with it. The guys began laughing at him. Jake placed his hand on the man's shoulder and explained that he wanted to offer guidance to someone who had failed the exam 6 times. He suggested that instead of going out and humiliating himself, he should give up. Paul stated that his advice would not be valuable to him. Jake went into a rage. He stated that he did not believe a person with such a problem could pass the exam regularly. The guy had absolutely no idea what he wanted from him. He remembered Jake had never behaved so brazenly and confidently before. It appeared that he was bothering the person because he had not seen this previously. Jake pledged to face him in a one-on-one fight. The first portion of the practical exam is aim shooting, which is officially known as the multi-summit shooting examination. His goal is straightforward. It is important to determine how many targets the future magician can attack simultaneously. However, this year's exam was more difficult because the targets were continually altering. Everyone watched and counted who hit how many targets. Angela was unable to do anything due to earlier failures. The average outcome was simply bad. The other guys hit 3 or 4 targets at most. Nobody could have predicted that a minor issue would cause such a significant decline in results. Someone in the audience commented that the quality of the present grads left much to be desired. The teachers were plainly disappointed, but they attempted to calm them down. Oliver indicated it was Jack's turn, and they could expect a nice outcome. Finally, he entered the arena. Jack yelled out to Paul, telling him to keep a close eye on his progress. Of course, the guy didn't know what his opponent was planning. There was a demand for the gentleman to begin taking the exam. Jack intended to highlight the distinction between himself and that unusual one. He began hitting the objectives. The guys were overjoyed, but they still had high hopes for him. There was no more doubt that he would be the first again. The man stepped forward, claiming that they had reared and nurtured a worthy successor to the family. Oliver inquired whether his colleagues believed this guy was the glory of their academy. According to him, he will undoubtedly be this year's representative at the huge festival. Bob requested the lecture not to go any farther. He stated that this level would be sufficient to measure the level of existing grad. Mike couldn't understand why they didn't sit for a while and watch Paul perform. Bob was startled to learn about the guy since he thought it would be impossible to pass the exam with his talents. Nonetheless, they chose to pay honor to his perseverance by watching the full show. Paul stood in the arena, believing that this was an excellent opportunity to demonstrate his might. The person asked him to start the show. Paul accepted and began forming a flame in his hand. A second later, he attached his other hand to it, causing several fireballs to form around him. The teachers were astounded and didn't comprehend how the man could summon magic so swiftly. The boys were also perplexed. Only Jack was enraged. He turned to face the others, reminding them of his opponent's fury. He claimed he could manufacture as many balls as he wanted, but he couldn't release them. Before he could complete his remark, he noticed Paul in action. The person employed a skill to accelerate his motions. He recently acquired the ability to refract time, allowing him to move extraordinarily quickly in any direction for 30 seconds. In other terms, he resembled a typhoon. With a single movement, all of the targets were completely destroyed. The teachers were startled to see this. The pupils likewise couldn't figure out how this was feasible. Paul was relieved that he had succeeded, but he could not entirely accept it. All targets were destroyed. The man behind him wrote down the number 27 in fear. The crowd was startled to witness the guy generate his own hand magic and use it to hit the targets. Nobody comprehended how he hit 27 targets because it was the Academy's best result ever. The guys couldn't figure out how he could move that quickly or whether he truly hit all of the targets with magic. Bob rose up from his seat and began applauding. He commended Paul, stating, "This performance was incredible." The guys were ecstatic and began congratulating the guy. Jack was upset and couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. Paul was taken aback by the acknowledgement and ovation because he hadn't seen it in 6 years. The man felt a warm sensation go across his chest. He seemed to have a constant need to feel this way. Oliver couldn't figure out why the person struck the targets with magic on his hands. He believed that this technique had nothing to do with magic. Mike believes that the unique quality of magic is its endless potential. He stated that if all goes as planned, it will no longer be magic, but mathematics. Oliver tried to respond again, but Bob urged him to stay quiet. The elderly man claimed that today he witnessed a miracle performed by a pupil. He declared it flawless. Bob stated that he observed different points of view among the lecturers. Oliver was outraged that everything went wrong due to this guy. He could not have imagined that things would turn out this way. Jason dragged Paul inside the premises in a nice manner. The man asked him to stop. The guys approached him and began to question how he had pulled off such a trick on yesterday's exam. They quickly resolved to acquire favor with themselves. Paul knew he was an outsider until yesterday, but it all changed suddenly. He told Jason he was going to go forward, of course. The guy irritated some people. He opened his room and noticed Jack standing in front of the window. Paul couldn't figure out what he was doing in someone else's room and yelled out to him. The guy did not respond, claiming that his opponent had become overly proud of gaining a few points through the use of something that could not be described as magic. He stated that Paul's contributions angered him, so he decided to advise him not to attempt to perform. The person said that his opponent was merely jealous because he had been in high places for 6 years. Jack became enraged and decided to continue the debate with threats. Paul carefully took his hand from himself. He continued to squeeze his opponent's hand. Jack was shocked when he realized how much power he had in his hands. Paul stated that it was critical for both of them to graduate and that if he had a strong desire to smash him, he should do so fairly in a one-on-one combat. He let go of his opponent's hand. Jack insisted that no one had the right to compete with him. He couldn't comprehend that a man who had been at the bottom for 6 years would suddenly desire to leave. Paul stated they should just wait and find out who won. Jack requested not to fail before the one-on-one stage of the fight and shut the door behind him. He walked along the corridor. Jack pulled his hand out of his pocket, enraged and confident that his opponent would not even make it to their joint combat. He glanced at it, recalling the strength with which it was grasped. The guy was unsure if his opponent was a wizard at all. The second step of the practical exam is the assessment of magical strength, the Academy's treasure, and a unique relic found only in a few locations across the continent. King Ram was converted into an item by the Archmage Freud 500 years ago. King Ram, encased in the artifact, absorbs wizards' mana and serves as a magical punching bag. In the second stage, pupils had to direct magic in order to achieve a high score. Paul understood that all he needed to do was aim at the statue and cast the spell he felt most confident in. He questioned Jason about it and he agreed with him. The guy explained that this organization was known for evaluating harshly, and receiving a score greater than 20 from him was already considered commendable. Somebody decided to utilize a thunderstorm on a monument. Because of his weakness, the statue asked that he hide from sight. The organization quickly urged that the man abandon magic forever. The boys were upset with the outcome, claiming that everything was as normal. The statue asked the next one to stand in front of her. The girl dashed after the guy to take his spot, telling him to keep an eye out. The pupil used an ice ball to show the statue that she was strong. The orc remarked her strength was outstanding and that he would remember her. This judgment took the girl by surprise. The statue clarified her statements, saying she was impressed by the girl's hopelessness. The girl was angry and burst into tears since she only received 2 points. She claimed that this was her best attack. Several more pupils failed the test. The main man requested that they not express their feelings in front of everyone, but rather let others to express themselves. He announced that Jack was next. The person employed powerful powers to get the statue's attention. The orc did not sense the power and expressed disappointment in him. Jack expressed his pride in becoming Jared Chill's third son. He mentioned his name in the hope that the statue would reconsider its judgment. The orc claimed that the guy's father was the same moron who requested him to inflate the scores. Of course, Jack possessed even less talent. The guy didn't get what he was saying because he had awarded him 27 points. The previous one advised him to calm down and called the next one Paul. The guy was nervous before the test. He determined to pull himself together and cope. Paul introduced himself to the monument and mentioned his name. The orc thought about it and stated that he had seen him for the first time. The statue decided it didn't matter and requested the guy to start. The boys were astonished to witness the flaming explosive mana. They believed that using Class 4 magic was still impossible for them. The statue was also perplexed as to why the man adopted such an unusual posture. Paul shook his head, indicating that he was launching an attack. He jumped high and swung. Paul felt incredibly confident. The guys watching were astounded as he moved the magic from his hand to his leg and instantly exploded it. The guys were equally astounded and concluded that such a spell should be assigned to Class 5. They weren't sure what to think. Somebody agreed that Paul was a Class 5 magician, no less. At this point, the participant was startled that his magic had worked. At the correct time, the guy realized that the statue's behavior was unusual. He was terrified that he would mistake him. The organization approached and inquired as to the identity of the individual. Paul stated that he had introduced himself earlier. The statue questioned whether the man was drunk. This caught him off guard. The orc stated that he had been waiting for draw all along and had now received it. The boys didn't understand who the statue was referring to. They felt it was just confusing Paul with someone else. Over the last 2 months, the man had reviewed all of the available texts but could not discover a single mention of Paul realized that the organization had some information about him. The guy asked the statue whether it knew who they were talking about. The organization responded that he did. Paul requested to tell him more about himself. The statue thought about it and found the question intriguing. The interlocutors could not believe they had encountered his incarnation at the academy. The person was taken aback and inquired again what incarnation meant. The statue requested him to repeat his name. Paul introduced himself. The orc considered it and stated that they would certainly remember him. The guy who was recording the results urged the statue to tell him the guy's score soon away before leaving. The orc stated that it was too much, so he would tell him later when no one was listening. He said the valuation was over and he couldn't assess the guy's magic. The guy didn't comprehend what the guy was saying, but he needed to record the results. He stated that under the guidelines, Mr. Kingram was required to evaluate the kids anyway. The person insisted that the contract be extended for another 5,000 years, but the orc interrupted him. He became enraged since he had been judging kids who didn't even look. Like a magician, the guy apologized for years but still wanted to know what score to give Paul. War considered it and decided to offer the evaluation nevertheless. He asked Paul which score he wanted, Z or 100 points. The guy was astounded to hear such a number. He kept his cool and stated that he wanted 100 points. The boys talked about his result. They couldn't believe it. Someone claimed that Paul had received such a grade for the first time in a century. The teacher stated that the student was once again at the center of the action. Paul wondered what the professor was doing here. The man stated that he had heard that he had earned 100 points from Kingram and that they had already reached the academy's head. He handed over a piece of paper and asked to keep it for himself. Paul unfolded the sheet to read about the artifact room. He questioned his interlocutor what the heck that was. The teacher asked him to follow him, and they closed the door behind them before going down. Paul was walking down some weird steps and stated that he had never seen them. The man said that this was the only area of the academy where everyone was forbidden. The guy had no idea what they were talking about or why he was brought here if everyone else was forbidden to be there. Mike stated that they were standing at the entrance to the artifact room and that he was only authorized to go this far. Paul inquired whether this meant he should go in there alone. The man hustled him and said he'd wait outside. The guy opened the door, not comprehending what was going on. He believed that his reward was waiting for him there and wished to see it as soon as possible. When he entered the room, he was amazed. Paul observed numerous objects that he had only heard of previously. He thought that this was the Archmage's magical warehouse. A mysterious voice behind him commented that the man appeared lost. Paul was terrified and turned around. It was the orc who insisted that the man did not understand his actual worth. Paul was shocked to learn that his interlocutor was no longer a stone statue. The orc inquired whether the individual was astonished that he was not in the form of a statue. According to him, this was the only area where he could appear in his actual form. He claimed that because of the ancient mana that permeated this area, he could be there in his body rather than as an artifact. The man questioned his interlocutor what he meant when he mentioned actual value. The orc responded that Paul simply did not grasp his significance. He claimed that this was abnormal behavior for someone who had used the same item as the player. The guy was startled to realize that his interlocutor was also aware of it. The orc claimed that this artifact was extremely rare, the only one of its kind. He was curious about how the guy obtained it and what connected him to draw. Paul admitted that he had no idea what they were talking about and had spent a long time trying to figure it out. His interlocutor remained quiet and thoughtful. He told of a creature who wished to become a god. One day he visited the Sky Peak tribe, to which the orc belonged. He was little and small, which was unattractive, but his power was so tremendous that no one in the tribe could resist it. Furthermore, he grew stronger by the day, and even multiple orcs were unable to defeat him. They respected him, and he lived among them as a member of their tribe. Draw taught the tribe's future leader the language and magic for nearly a century. Paul was taken aback by the age and wondered how somebody could live so long. The orc said that he was not human, but rather a black dragon named Drek. Paul couldn't believe what he'd heard. He learned that dragons do exist. The guy inquired as to whether or not this information was correct. The orc questioned whether he knew where magic comes from. Of course, Paul had only heard stories about dragons and thought they were just legends. The orc claimed that Draw was unable to wield magic. Instead, he was devising a method of combat similar to the guy by filling his arms and legs with magic. He inquired if his interlocutor understood what he was saying now. Paul assumed Draw was treated the same as he was. He stated that he understood him. The orc claimed that Draw had devised an ability that only he could use. He showed him how to turn magic into power. Draw used it to become the most powerful being in the world, but he was not pleased and continued to grow his strength indefinitely. This lasted until he destroyed everything around him, including himself. Paul ran through this information in his thoughts, realizing why he was dubbed the Destroyer of Worlds. He could not have imagined how powerful Draw was to annihilate an entire world. The person noticed that he had a new achievement. He had been given the title of Orc's Friend. Paul was taken aback by the unexpected prize. He assumed that conversation with such important heroes could not be idle. He also earned the talent Orc's Rage, which enhances strength for 30 minutes. Paul noticed it and considered it. He held a weird white orb in his hands, realizing that it represented his power. The orc noticed that the guy had gotten a reward for the structure. He claimed that Dre had a propensity of discussing such topics while peering into. Paul handed the ball to Organ and asked him what it was. The interlocutor considered it and wanted to take a closer look. He commented that this thing appeared unusual. The man inquired if he knew anything about this object. Organ considered it and concluded that it was not a thing but an embodiment. Paul didn't know what an embodiment was. The interlocutor went on to add that he was always around Draw and couldn't ask him. He imagined Draw had locked him in the spirit stone when he died. This was the manifestation of his strength. Although it is termed a spirit, it is not the same as other spirits. Strawn had a horrible personality and begged him for unlimited power every day. However, if his requests were granted, he would guarantee the owner unlimited power. The person inquired whether the incarnation was born from this stone. Orc answered it was, but there was no need to panic. He expected to wake up soon. Paul stared at Strand with terror and noticed that he was breaking down. When the person realized he was holding a little bear, he was taken aback. He didn't know what this could signify. The small creature was offended and said it wasn't a bear. Paul was astounded. He had no idea how a bear could converse. The odd thing threatened and begged that it not be called such anymore. Paul still didn't grasp who was in front of him. He questioned how a bear could possibly speak. The creature again attempted to emphasize that it was not a bear. According to him, the man had no right to compare him to an animal. Paul wondered who he was. Strand said that he was an incarnation free of form. He could be whatever he wished. The creature drew attention to itself, claiming that it would now demonstrate its might. Paul stared at it with amazement. Strand attempted to do something, but nothing worked. He was astounded at where his power had gone and why he couldn't reincarnate. He still didn't grasp what his interlocutor was doing. The bear suggested that the issue was that he was reconstructing on an empty stomach. He insisted that Paul feed him, which Paul found odd. The guy stated that there was no food in this location and he had no idea what he could eat. The beast was outraged and didn't understand why its present owner was so weak that he couldn't feed it. Paul was startled to learn that he was the owner. The bear turned away and went to bed, stating he would wake him up if anything unusual happened. The guy was still perplexed. Orc was pleased to see this creature because, according to him, 1,000 years had passed and his character remained unchanged. He added that looking at Paul and Strand reminded him of the good old days. They brought back memories of Strand and the Sky Peak tribe, whom he had met in his homeland. Orca returned to the throne and inquired as to what the man intended to do next. Paul didn't comprehend the question and asked it again. His interlocutor spoke to the strength that makes him stronger. He believes that technology has the power to either guide or destroy people. He sought power in order to protect his people from demons, raise the Ardell family name, and properly declare himself to those who detested him. Paul decided that was enough for now. He had a lot to protect, and he would not turn down this opportunity. So the guy chose to live his life freely for his community, family, and himself. Or commended him for his intentions and stated he'd see what he did in the future. Despite learning about Draw's identity, Paul's daily routine remained unchanged, with the exception of one detail. He would call out to Strand and ask him to wake up. The bear appeared before him and asked whether there was any food for him. Strand's sole change in life was that he was given more food. He was preoccupied with food. He ate a lot of it, and not just any food. After finishing his meal, he declared he felt better. The meal in question represents the power he obtains through Strand strengthens as the vessel expands, sharing all with it. He now got access to a unique on-year ability. This skill accelerates his development. Every time Paul gets stronger, he gains 100 more power. Strand was pleased because his master would receive twice when he received 2 stars. He revealed that prior to the ceiling, he had 31 stars. Paul was astounded since that was 310 horsepower. The child hadn't even reached 1,000 yet, but he already felt extremely powerful. He pondered how Draw had risen to such a position. He believed that completing missions was not the only way to gain power. Strand giggled and explained why he was termed outstanding. He suggested that if the youngster wants to know the secret, he give him a glass of water. Paul threatened to stop feeding him if he didn't shut up. Strand looked guilty and offered to tell him for free. There are numerous ways to become stronger. For example, you can attempt more challenging quests. Strength is also gained when crafting things or discovering an artifact. You can also boil ogre tendon to create an elixir. Strand stated that neither of these options suited Paul. The child was shocked since there were so many alternatives. According to the interlocutor, first, he must gain at least 1,000 strength, and Strand warned the youngster that his body would be unable to handle such rapid power growth. Paul felt he had become stronger, but it turns out he is only at the beginning of his adventure. In that scenario, his next aim is 1,000 strength, thus he must continue training. The person worked out every day to build his physical strength, and when he reached 930, the 3rd level of the exam began, real fighting. Strand inquired as to if today was the actual test. Paul said that it was, and he had been anticipating this day for a long time. In a genuine combat test, mages typically attack from behind, therefore there is a probability that the spell will strike one of them. This test will determine how much mages manage hazards. This step was the most significant. Jason unleashed a fireball. The guys in armor didn't comprehend what he was doing and advised him not to aim at them. Some guy said Jason was out of the competition. Knights were invited to assist with and administer the exam in order to ensure the pupils' safety, and the guys laughed at Jason. The test lasted 10 days, and the students were assigned different monsters based on their points total. At the end of the final day, 13 kids with high scores had been recognized. Since this is the last day of the test, everyone is curious what kind of monster will appear before them. The boys had no idea what type of noise it was, and their expectations were met as an orc appeared in front of them. Orcs live in groups and are distributed across the continent. They are far larger than humans and possess comparable intellectual capacities. They are inherently harsh, thus there are ongoing confrontations between them and humans. They didn't know how to combat him in this exam. They feared that someone might perish at his hands. Mike insisted that the mages remain sober. He said they should treat this like a real combat and give it their all. The orc went on the offensive, charging towards the knights. Jack formed magical spheres behind them to reflect his onslaught. He used a great arrow, but the opponent jumped back, and the spell missed him. Everyone was taken aback by how high he jumped. Mike commanded that Jake dodge. The guy didn't know how because his entire body was paralyzed with terror. Mike used the tree prison to guard the individual. The orc was tied up. He attempted to resist, but the teacher's spell was too powerful. Nonetheless, he didn't have time to touch Jake when he suggested that the guy drop out. The man banged his fist upon the table. Oliver was furious that Jake had failed the exam yet again, and he resolved to prevent Paul from passing it. The man asked Bob if he intended to continue testing in the same spirit. The old man inquired as to what his interlocutor was hinting at. Oliver mentioned that it would soon be Paul's time. Bob agreed with him, and the conversation continued. The man added that Paul was the only student to obtain a flawless score from King Ram. He believes that evaluating him on the same basis as the other students would be unjust. Bob stated that he understood his intentions. He stated that sadly, they had no other monsters prepared. Oliver stated that they had one. When the knights delivered the orcs, they were accompanied by another ogre. Using an ogre during the exam is obviously perilous, but the professors and knights are there. Oliver expressed a desire to see what Paul was truly capable of. A lengthy corridor appeared and the man reclined against the wall, gazing away. The hero heard someone address him and mention the man's name. Putting his hand forward, the professor stated that before beginning, he needed to inform him that today's test would be more difficult than the others. To which the hero inquired. Looking at the hero, Mike stated that the Academy had high expectations for him because he had given him the highest score. As a result, some people believe it is unfair to assign him the same monster as the others, making things more difficult for him. The protagonist replied that he meant it as well, but the man interrupted him and stated that he would not be battling an orc. The hero opened his eyes in amazement when he heard it, but it was an ogre, so he asked again. The bear grinned and mentioned that his first real opponent was an ogre. It would be enjoyable. The monster's hand was chained securely. The beast raised its head and roared loudly. Looking at it, Jason questioned whether it was the orc captain, to which the man answered that it was an ogre. The young guy frowned, believing that an ogre could not exist. The man grasped the blade fiercely, thinking he had been instructed to bring it. Looking at the creature, he stated that he did not believe it was appropriate to employ an ogre to assess skills. How strong was the student? Outwardly, ogres resemble orcs, although they are much stronger. They can break a skull or shift vertebrae with a single stroke. The person clenched his teeth and questioned if he was certain of this, claiming that even the knights were having problems arresting him. To which the professor replied that indeed, this was the order of the Academy's head. The knight grinned and commented that it seems that the Academy enjoyed putting their lives on the line. The protagonist stepped forward and stated, yes, he would put his life on the line. The knight turned back and questioned, what? Looking at him, the protagonist stated that Paul, a test participant, was his main concern. The knight smiled and inquired what he was looking at. The knight assumed that this man was pitted against the monster, as if he could defeat him. Frowning, he stated that if something happened, he and the professor would protect him. But wait, where was he going? Looking away, the knight stated that he was traveling in the wrong direction before asking what he was doing. Turning around, the protagonist said that he was preparing for the test, to which the man responded that he was not present and required to stand behind. The knight was shocked and asked again after learning that he would battle from there. The hero lowered his brow and explained that his spells were different from the norm. Looking at him, the knight stated that they would be unable to protect him if he was in front. This was no ordinary orc. The hero replied that he knew, to which the man questioned why he was taking such a risk. The protagonist removed his cloak and explained that he was simply determined. The man looked at the protagonist in bewilderment. Fred frowned, thinking that he felt no dread from him. He assumed that he was indeed different from the rest. The professor extended his hand and instructed Paul to get ready. The man clicked his fingers and announced that his exam was starting. The ogre's shackles suddenly slid off his hands. The beast charged forward, screaming. The protagonist also ran at him. The man asked him in terror what he was doing and assumed he was rushing right towards the ogre. The man shouted at him to halt and think about his plans. The monster swung his hand and yelled. Two flashes emerged in the sky. The hero, extending his hand forward, screamed about a fireball. Paul collided with the creature and flames appeared around them. Fred crouched down, assuming he had used the spell in close combat. The man shielded himself from the flames with his hand. The student squinted at the smoke. The man sprang up and questioned in amazement what smoke had appeared in front of the knights. The thought occurred to him that the Magic Academy student had launched an attack. He hoped he was still alive. Suddenly, the image of the hero showed through the smoke, and the knight believed he was alive. Looking at the protagonist, he said, "How is he still standing?" The professor smiled slightly. The knight placed his hand on the hero's shoulder and turned towards him. Looking at the hero, Fred yelled that he should have told him straight immediately. He nearly died. The protagonist apologized to the man. The knight was astonished and asked again, would he have allowed him to act like that? The protagonist then looked to the side and indicated that now was not the time to chat. Instead, he would finish the test. The ogre snarled and raised his palm as smoke poured out of his mouth. The man stated he should back off. He knew he was strong, but it was too hazardous. Fred grinned and suggested that he step aside while they figured things out. The man took a step forward, but the hero beat him to it. Looking at the knight, the protagonist said that this was his test. To which he inquired again. The protagonist frowned and said they should let him finish it. Paul looked at the monster and wondered how this had happened. An ogre 5 times his size loomed in front of him. The hero grimaced and stated that he must battle against it. Looking straight ahead, Paul perceived 2 causes for his courage. The title of Ogre's friend arose, which increased the possibility that ogres would not be hostile towards them. The impact of this title enabled him to talk with ogres. The hero believed that the first was his expertise, namely the title he obtained from the guy, which enabled him to interact with ogres. The monster's eyes flared crimson as he warned him not to approach and release him, and the protagonist assumed he understood what he was yelling. Ordinary people only saw a ferocious creature, not him. The ogre was terrified since he was surrounded by mages and knights. A crucial mission arose. Time to battle. He couldn't avoid the enemy. Let him defeat the enemy faster than the others. Aim 1 is to strike the enemy with a fist. Aim 2 is to defeat him. Strength plus 30 and improved player vision are the rewards. The hero mistook the second assignment for an unexpected one. The protagonist laughed enthusiastically and believed it was a magnificent prize for him to be forced to do the same duty every day, 3 days at a time. Paul pushed forward. A flame appeared in his hand, and he saw no need to hesitate. The protagonist punched the creature with his fist. The ogre glanced at the protagonist with horror. The creature was engulfed by fire. A notification arrived indicating that the enemy's fist's first goal had been fulfilled, and Paul stated that it was not the end. The ogre was furious and threatened to kill him. Suddenly, the creature leapt up and swung. The ogre was quickly approaching the hero. Looking down, the monster yelled, "I'm going to break his head!" The protagonist carefully retreated from the impact. Paul gritted his teeth and decided he needed to uncover his weak spot. Rushing forward, the hero explained that time was a refraction. Knight was shocked and wondered where such speed came from. Paul ran forward and considered going closer. Flames appeared on the hero's hands and struck his stomach. The hero went on to say that he would also target the susceptible point. The knight frowned, thinking he hadn't flinched against the ogre. Who was he? The guy questioned, shocked what was going on, to which the other answered, "Wait and see." The protagonist attacked, and the pupil exclaimed that the monster was fighting back. The creature tightened his fist hard. The protagonist engaged it in battle. Paul suddenly struck from his knee. The ogre grasped his leg sharply. The protagonist soared backward and performed a somersault while in the air. Paul landed on the floor. Suddenly, the protagonist opened his eyes, surprised. The hero avoided the ogre's attack. The protagonist landed behind the beast. Turning around, the monster claimed that the rat was suspicious. Paul suddenly jumped up. The ogre seemed bewildered. The hero hit the beast from behind. The ogre suddenly dropped to the ground. Sharply, Paul jumped on top of him. Looking at him, he decided it was time to stop this. The ogre's fury skill makes him stronger for 30 seconds. Looking at the hero in terror, the monster wondered if he was really human. The ogre's eyes opened when he heard it. He hadn't expected him to respond. Looking at the hero, the ogre inquired if he understood what he was saying, to which Paul responded that if he did, what he was saying was correct. The ogre stated that he did when the hero yelled about exploding burning mana and attacked. The anger skill enhanced the blow. The protagonist clenched his teeth furiously as he switched into berserker mode. Flames spread everywhere. The ogre lay unconscious. Looking at him, the protagonist assumed that this was all the bear. Looking straight ahead, he concluded that he was not bad, perhaps even better than he had anticipated. The protagonist stood in the midst of the flames. It was said that he thoroughly defeated him. He thought, yes. The students joyously raised their hands and exclaimed, "Keep it up, it's cool." The man frowned, thinking he had won. Bob smiled as he looked straight ahead. The knights gathered around the creature. A query was posed. Did he defeat the ogre on his own? How was that possible? The knight folded his arms and turned to the hero, asking who had trained him to fight. Paul said, "No one." The man scowled and inquired what he wanted to say. That he taught himself? The protagonist gritted his teeth and responded, "I do." Paul extended his hand, asking if he could find out the outcome of his test. The professor saw the hero as a dead ogre, and Mike stated that he did not believe he could defeat him, yet he did not offer him the opportunity to intervene. Standing in front of the hero, the professor stated that he had once again exceeded his expectations, to which the hero responded that indeed a training field appeared. The man stated that he had passed. The protagonist smiled slightly. A notification flashed indicating that the task had been finished. The idea was to punch the enemy and defeat them. The reward was the player's eye skill, which increased strength by 30. The protagonist was surprised and wondered, a minute? The player's eye? It was stated that the passive skill was optimal. He was able to see the nature of everything thanks to the player's eye. He can now collect and digitize data. He can detect surveillance and monitor the invisible. Looking at the bear, the protagonist noticed the player's eye, indicating that he had now become a legitimate player. The hero then asked if she was familiar with this skill. The bear smiled and added, "Of course, this is something only a player can have." Standing atop the hero's shoulder, the bear said that adversaries who use stealth or invisibility spells will appear differently to him. A faint outline will be visible around them. To which the hero said that it is quite handy. The hero was astonished to hear that the minimap had been opened, so he inquired again. The map appeared. The bear said that with its help, it is possible to see everything within a 500-meter radius. So, a message appeared indicating that he could view the status pane for the specified target. The material available for viewing is determined by the target's level, to which Ted folded his hands and stated that there are other surprises. Looking straight, he said that he would use the player's eye to examine the defeated ogre, to which the hero inquired as to what he should look at. The protagonist, looking at the monster, thought that with the player's eye, it was written that the ogre is a shoulder blade, lives in the Thunder Mountains, is distinguished by protruding shoulder blades, is smaller than ordinary ogres, and, in addition to a softer disposition, is to which the hero reasoned that he would be able to see the state of the target. Paul grinned and said, "That is impressive." Looking at the man, the protagonist concluded that it was necessary to check the professor. It was written by a 6th-class magician and is not yet available for reading. Continuing to stare at the man, the hero stated that there was something he couldn't see. The information was limited, to which Ted responded that he couldn't learn anything about individuals much stronger than him. The bear raised his hand, claiming that as his strength increased, so did the amount of information available for viewing. His days, the protagonist stated, were clear. After finishing the exam with a real combat, reports circulated around the academy that he had defeated the monster. Jason, sitting on a bench, inquired how it felt to have everyone talking about him, to which the protagonist replied that he had no idea. It was still new to him. Suddenly, someone behind the hero stated that he was seeking forgiveness. Looking straight ahead, the girl inquired whether he was Paul. Standing in front of the hero, the girl stated that he had done exceptionally well in the 3rd level of the test. "Let him take it," one remarked, while another suggested that he eat it if he was hungry. The female started to depart, and the hero stared at them. The protagonist lifted the bag and asked what he wanted, to which the man replied in astonishment. The guy clenched his teeth and said it was incredibly insulting to the female, who overcome her humiliation and brought him a snack, prompting Paul to inquire why he was so upset. A tear emerged in the guy's eyes, and the protagonist assumed that this guy, Jason, was looking at him. He realized he had a lot of potential after seeing it through the player's eyes. It was stated that Jason, a 2nd-class magician, possessed great promise. Looking at the guy, the protagonist realized that during the last 2 days, he had tested everyone in the academy, and only the guy had high potential. Looking to the side, the protagonist stated that he should strive a bit more and that he was confident he would perform well in the next test. In the yard, it was heard that it was instantly filled with his pity, to which the main character responded that no, he simply wanted to express that he had high potential and good talents. So all that remains is to recover confidence and work harder, to which the person inquired whether it was real. Sitting next to him, the main character agreed and told him not to spend all of his time playing games. Jason said that it was good. His goal for the following stage would be to place in the top 10. That would be problematic. Looking at the hero, the person said, "Let me listen. Is this really you? As he stated that it can be difficult to believe at times, prompting the hero to inquire as to his meaning. Raising his hand, the man asked whether he was the same Paul he knew and had been speaking with for 6 years. The hero asked again. Raising his head, the main character reflected on how difficult it is for him to believe at times. A flame emerged in front of the main character, and he learned that there had been some whispers about him recently, which prompted the hero to ask again. The guy then went on to say that he will push Miguel aside and become not just the top graduate, but also a representative of the academy. The guy was startled to learn that he had no interest in this. They would go indoors. The man caught up with the hero and inquired how he could not be interested. He stated that this was the year of the great festival. The great event takes place in the 5th month of each year when delegates from prestigious schools convene to judge who is the best among them, culminating in a magical event. An Olympiad is conducted every 8 years, with participants competing for the title of Best Magician. The great festival is known as the convergence of these two events. This is a national competition for the top pupils from the most well-known schools. To win this festival, the academy he represents will get not only a large monetary award, but also a number of other benefits. As a result, the number of competitors is limited to 1 student for individual events and 30 for group tournaments. As a result, 30 academy participants will be eligible to compete. The protagonists believe that the person chosen for individual competition. In the cafeteria, they heard that people were wondering who would be the representative this year. Jake, seated at the table, stated that of course it would be Paul. The other responded yes, and he was the only magician to receive 100 points. Jason, holding a fork, told him to remember all the times Jake participated in the magic festival. He asked if they remembered his performances. Sitting in front of him, the protagonist stated that there may be nothing to say about group events and that he had finished last 4 out of 5 individual tournaments. The guy claimed that because of him, they were labeled the academy of last place, and were unable to perform with dignity in either solo or group competitions. The students walked around the cafeteria. Someone suggested the only way to get rid of this guy was to send Paul, but was he wrong? He was told no, and they all agreed. They inquired as to Paul's personal opinion. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist stated that the exam had not yet concluded and that it was too early to anticipate anything. Finally, the participants in the great festival are chosen based on the first semester exam results and the faculty's recommendations. There is still a 4th stage to go. He faced Miguel one-on-one. The protagonist grimaced and stated that he needed to focus on the next test, after which he realized that all he could think about was beating him. 4 days after the 3rd stage ended, the guy suddenly jumped up. The protagonist kicked. It was said that he had gained 1,000 strength. Ted raised his hands and declared that he had been waiting for this day since he achieved the achievement. He requested that they now began raising the level. The bear looked up. It stated that the repeated assignment had progressed to level 2. Ted suddenly jumped up. The hero glanced at the pet with surprise. Flames were flying around the bear. It was stated that the difficulty of the recurring task was doubled, but the reward was tripled. The bear swallowed something, stretched his arms to the sides, and flew upward, emitting an abundance of lightning. Looking at him, the protagonist wondered what the flame was. The protagonist questioned, eyes wide awake, what it was. He stood and gazed out the window. The man scowled and thought, damn. In the end, it brought him additional points. Of Covenant was showed, and the professor said, would Jake be able to defeat Paul? The protagonist stared at the fellow, and the man thought, now that was doubtful. The professor bowed his head, realizing that not only was his participation in the great festival at stake, but also his position as the best graduate. But the guy's family belongs at the top of the academy. Gritting his teeth violently, he said that no matter what, Ted stood in the middle of the fire. The embodiment of strength as countries advanced to 2nd place. A flame appeared in the protagonist's hands, and he gained an additional 200 strength as a reward. The protagonist observed that the bear appeared to have grown. Stretching his palm forward, Paul inquired as to what had occurred, claiming that thanks to him, his strength had swiftly reached the 1200 indicator. To which Ted protested, smiling broadly. The bear claimed that this was only the beginning. I bet that the difficulty of the tasks and the reward have also increased. Looking at the menu Ted said they would see, it was written about not just the repetition of tasks, but also about body training. He had attained the fundamental level of physical strength required for battle. However, training never ends led him to progress. Punch, 0 out of 5,000. Kick, 0 out of 5,000. Roundhouse kick, 0 out of 5,000. 15-kilometer run, 0 out of 1. Real combat training, 0 out of 1. Reward, strength plus 30. Putting his palm to his face, the protagonist stated that he had already completed the increased amount of repetitions, so it would not be difficult. But staring at the bear, the protagonist wondered what type of serious combat training this was. Ted raised his hand, asking whether he remembered their first meeting. He claimed that he could transform into any person standing in front of him. The protagonist confirmed that he recalled, and Ted stated that he can now change, but there are constraints for the time being. The training camp appeared. When asked if he could take the form of a human, Ted said that he could when he reached the 5th rank, but complete transformation would be tough. In any event, the bear grins. Hearing it, he wondered who he could become and what he wanted. Ted began to swirl around and his movement speed increased. Suddenly, an odd sight appeared. Looking at the creature, the protagonist wondered what the scarecrow was doing in front of him. The hero heard, "What?" and what kind of reply it was, to which the protagonist responded that he should ignore it. He was just expecting something different. When their battle appeared, Ted advised him not to look down on the scarecrow. He inquired whether he recognized how beneficial he was when he first began real training. Standing in front of him, the protagonist questioned what the actual ones were, implying that he was acting as a dummy, to which he replied, "Certainly," or more specifically, the role of an assistant in carrying out the duty. The scarecrow grinned as he realized he needed to train every day in a real combat with him, to which he said yes. Smoke appeared around the scarecrow, and he stated that because he was still weak, he was just a 3rd-class mage. Ted grinned and stated that once he regained his old power, anything would be possible. Monsters emerged, and he said that if he wished, he could transform into a demon or a dragon. Putting his palm to his face, the protagonist announced that they would begin training right away, to which Ted inquired, "What?" "Leave all my pox," the protagonist replied, grinning. "That's a mage," Ted exclaimed in amazement, saying, "That's good." Suddenly, a charge materialized in his hands, and the bear was holding a staff. Standing in front of the hero, he claimed that even if his magic hit him, it would only knock him back and cause no damage. The hero then inquired, "What about him?" The hero rejoiced as he learned he could attack as much as he wished. The protagonist began to flee when Ted said, "Okay, he's attacking." The flames spread around and Ted said, "Okay, he's attacking." Ted said, "Okay, he's attacking." The protagonist thought that Jake, like him, was probably training right now and couldn't wait for their fight. And looking at the sheet, the guy turned to his uncle and said that this brat was annoying him. He asked what he should do. The man clenched his teeth and demanded to know why the damn boy was blackmailing him. Jake frowned and said that he had heard that. He had suggested putting an ogre against him, and that as a result, he got the best possible result. It would be better for them to think together about how to fix the situation. Looking at his uncle, Jake said that if he became the representative of the academy at the Great Festival, to which the man replied that he should not worry, he had an idea. The man handed him the flask and told him to take it. Jake looked at her in surprise and said that it was the awakening herb, the flaming flower. The awakening herb, the flaming flower, grows in the northern territories of hallucinations and is a rare and valuable medicinal plant, sometimes used to create special elixirs. Oliver extended his hand forward and said that if he drinks this, he will receive the effect of awakening, which will significantly reduce the time of invocation of spells, to which the guy replied that as a side effect, he will experience pain and will stop distinguishing between his own and others. Right, smirking, the man replied that yes, to put it simply, he would not see anything. It seems that he does not sleep in his lessons. Holding the flask in his hand, Jake asked, "But why is this? Should he actually drink it?" To which the man answered him that, yes. In the garden, they heard that he had gone crazy, to which Oliver replied that he had found a reason to complain. He had already lost to that guy, and now he wanted to be expelled from the family in disgrace. Looking straight ahead, the guy said that, but it was still a risky undertaking. The professor knew perfectly well what he was capable of. If he noticed changes, he would not remain silent. Grinning, the man asked what the guy was at a loss, listening to what Ideation.com. So will he do it or not? Finally, the day of one-on-one fights arrived, and the exam stage was held in the Mona Barrier room. The students watched in amazement. It was heard that every year during the one-on-one fights, the stands were filled to capacity. Finally, it was time for the final battle, and the protagonist was warming up his hands. It was added that Paul was against Jake. The guy took a step forward. Looking to the side, the protagonist thought that the last stage of the exam was finally here, and he was fighting against Jake. Looking at the hero, Tet said that the opponent knew that he would try to close the distance. If he was ready for it, it would be difficult for him to fight. Grinning, the protagonist thought that, but if he could still get there, to which he replied that then, yes, one blow would be enough. The guys looked at each other. It was said that since this test was as close to the conditions of a real fight as possible, various geographical objects were placed in the hall. Looking down, the man asked if they were ready, to which they replied that they were. The protagonist looked at the guy in surprise. Frowning, Paul thought that this bastard. The guy clenched his fists furiously, and the hero added that his condition was far from normal. Looking to the side, the protagonist thought that he was not as impudent as usual. Something was wrong here. Jake, a third-class mage with high potential, a dual summoning feature, and a hidden berserk special state was written in the player's eye. The protagonist gritted his teeth and thought that he had never seen such a notification, and he took something in a hidden state so that others would not find out that he had drunk a certain drug. The man folded his arms, and the hero, the protagonist, raised his hand, to which the man inquired as to what was going on. Points are awarded based on the level of magic that hits the enemy. The man looked away and added that there was no need to be concerned about his opponent. They were currently in the Mona Barrier Hall, where the effectiveness of magic was reduced by 99%. The man put his hands out to the sides and exclaimed, "It's good." Paul lowered his head, convinced that he had no evidence, only he could see the status window, thus no one would believe him. The protagonist frowned and stated that they needed some ironclad proof. The protagonist stood across from Jake. The man shouted that it was time to leave. The boys surged towards one another. When they learned that they had begun, a green glow appeared around the youngster, and he yelled for Paul to die. A plant began to grow around the hero's leg. Then it snapped. The students appeared surprised. It was reported that this was how he got out so rapidly. Jake's spell failed to work on him correctly. Rushing forward, the protagonist reflected on how wonderful the Mana Barrier room was. It reduced Mana's power while having no effect on his strength. A skull emerged over the youngster, and he said that he assumed he'd stop there. When the boy shouted about fire breathing, the skeleton released fire. The hero swiftly jumped between the flames, utilizing acceleration. The protagonist hurried forward. Paul ran behind a stone. The hero peeked out from behind it, looking directly ahead. The protagonist considered Jake's potion's effects, which included reduced summoning time and enhanced mana collecting. The man smiled broadly and said that it was enough to hide. Let him out. Looking away, the protagonist believed he was more enthusiastic than usual. Now he was certain he had drunk from a plant. A flame blossom, an awakening plant. The man laughed loudly and told Paul to come out. So the hero reasoned that hand tremors, exaggerated expression, pain receptor suppression, and a weakened capacity to discern between opponents and buddies all matched. The hero scowled, thinking that the only thing left to confirm was a decrease in pain sensitivity. Standing in front of him, the protagonist stated that it was not unexpected that he was so certain, and that it was all because of this, correct? Jake inquired again, smirking. The protagonist explained that it was due to the blazing flower. He was astonished to hear that. It didn't matter, he was going to defeat him nonetheless. The hero extended his hand and said, "Get ready." The protagonist hurried onward, utilizing time refraction. The guy looked worried and thought, "Damn, he's too fast." The protagonist was approaching Jake. Looking at the guy, the protagonist exclaimed that it was pointless. Suddenly, an enormous ice wall emerged in front of the guy. The professor seemed surprised. It was said that this was some sort of magic. Was it magic at all? It caught up to him in an instant. When a monster appeared, Jake shouted that he should bite. A fire lizard is a third-class magical creature. The protagonist shook his fist and shouted about an earthquake. Suddenly, an explosion ripped through the entire battlefield. The lizard flew upward. Students exclaimed in amazement. It was reported that he subdued the fire element using an earth spell. The youngster cried in terror. No! Dick suddenly raised his head and screamed at the main character not to come closer. The main character grinned and stated that he should not be such a softy and accept it. The youngster looked at the hero's hand and begged the main character to flick him. The battlefield outside appeared. Suddenly flames appeared in front of the hero. The youngsters were delighted as they watched the battle. The gray haze slowly dispersed. The main figure looked directly ahead. The boy's eyes were crimson, and he stated he shouldn't look down on him. The child was talking about a minor flick when the hero abruptly hit him. The youngster shouted loudly, prompting the hero to run towards him. Jake suddenly slid to the ground, laying on the cracks. The person chuckled and questioned what he thought could defeat him with such a weak blow, saying that it didn't hurt at all. And the hero believed that he was still conscious even after such a punch. Jake may die from his injuries if he continues at this rate. The hero grasped the guy's shoulder and warned him that continuing the test was perilous. Suddenly, the hero summoned a shackling tree for the man. The protagonist raised his hand and stated that Jake had used a forbidden drug. The man stood in front of the protagonist and inquired what he meant. Jake knows he used the substance. He stated that if it was a lie, he would be disqualified. Looking at him, the protagonist responded, "Yes, I am certain because the use of the drug can always be hidden by others." That confused the man. The inspector can either ignore the infringement or say whatever he likes. The protagonist stated that he is the one who can obtain various rare materials for his favorite and conducts drug testing before to matches. The man was astonished to hear this. Only one person in the academy suited that description. Certainly the professor vanished and the hero inquired, "If you think about it, Professor Oliver is Jake's uncle," to which the man said, "I should wait. In that scenario, the professor is definitely the man." He suddenly ran up to them and inquired if they understood what he was saying. The professor reacted aggressively, asking whether he was suggesting Jake had taken the drug and turned a blind eye to it. The protagonist smiled and responded that he did and could. "You prove it?" the man asked again, and the professor replied, "That's wonderful. Then we would conduct another drug test," to which the hero interrupted and said that it was pointless. He had given him a special elixir to conceal the fact that he had taken it, hadn't he? Looking away, the man asked what in that case was he proposing to do. He stated he could show everything. The protagonist laid his palm on the tree and said he would display it right now. Suddenly, a great glow appeared in front of them. Despite the fact that Jake's magic had gotten stronger after practice, he continued to laugh and remain conscious after such a blow, which is unusual. The protagonist stretched his hand forward. The tree was incinerated, and the hero said that such was the force of the flick he gave Jake. The guy laughed loudly, and the hero added that he continues to laugh. "Allow him to go to his workplace." The professor exclaimed in terror. The protagonist took a step forward. Paul stood in front of a massive gate. A bright glow appeared around the hero. He was summoned to the head. The events of the fourth stage swept through the academy like a storm. Jake was expelled, Professor Oliver was fired, and their family's fraud was revealed. Looking straight ahead, he said that no, it was different. Suddenly, something appeared in front of him, and he said that this too, there was a chair in front of the hero. He thought about what Bob's throne was, where the king of magicians sat, and then asked, "What's going on here?" Suddenly, a man appeared behind him, asking what he saw, to which he turned to him. Walking along a forest path, the leader said that the appearance of this place was created with the help of Malok's eye, and asked what he knew it was. To which the protagonist replied that he had heard of it. Malok, this name belonged to the leader of the demons, who invaded the continent of They say he had the power to make the target see what it most desired. After Malok's fall, his parts were turned into artifacts. Looking to the side, Bob asked if Malok's eye shows the world he wants to see and the images around him are close to what he wants to see. Lowering his head, the protagonist thought that what he wanted to see was the flourishing of the Ardell territory and becoming the best. Bob turned to the hero and asked what was interesting about what he saw here, to which the protagonist clarified what he saw. Looking at the hero, the leader said that a world in which students behave like students and magicians like magicians. Standing in front of the gate, the man said that of course he understands that this is not easy to achieve, to which the protagonist confirmed. Suddenly, the gate opened slightly and the protagonist turned back. The hero was surprised to hear that he called him because he wanted to ask something, clarified that he would answer him, to which the protagonist replied that, of course. The man folded his arms and asked how he could tell that Jake had used the flaming flower. The protagonist looked down. Sitting in front of the man, Paul said that Jake was acting unusually. He immediately thought of the flaming flower because of his aggressive and at the same time anxious behavior, and the flow of mana around him was unusual, and the mana itself was strengthened. Bob leaned on the table and said that, but based on what he saw, he did not suspect him of taking the flower, but was sure of it. He asked what the reason was. The protagonist said that he used physical strength, not magic, and the mana barrier room suppresses only magic without affecting physical strength. He then thought that there was no need to talk about the player's eye. Looking at the chapter, the hero said that even if Jake was in a state of shock, his laughter, despite the injuries received, can only be explained by the use of the flaming flower. The man thought about how at 16 he was perceptive enough to instantly notice subtle changes in his opponent and was able to remain calm in critical situations, taking into account his undeniable magical abilities. Putting his hand on the table, Bob said that as the head of the academy, he was terribly sorry for what happened, apologized, and would personally ensure that their family did not harm him. The man raised his hand and added that he also had a proposal. The protagonist was surprised to hear that he would like to participate in the grand festival that would be held in the 7th month of this year. As a representative of their academy, Paul's eyes widened. He thought of the representative of the academy at the grand festival, a status that everyone dreams of. He had his suspicions, even when he was called to the head of the academy's office. The protagonist closed his eyes and remained silent. The man was surprised to hear that. He thanked him for his proposal. However, sitting in front of the head of the academy, the hero said that as far as he knew, he lacked experience as he had not participated in a real battle for the past 5 years. Lowering his head, the protagonist said that due to the disorder of mana release, all events were closed to him, so he did not know whether he could perform well in the grand festival against other talented peers. The hero was surprised to hear that this was not a problem at all. In fact, as a judge in the grand festival, he believed, raising a finger. The head of the academy continued that he was more than worthy of being considered a candidate for victory. To this, the hero asked again, sitting in front of the man. The man said that he could confidently say that he had every chance of winning, and what was much more frightening, the hero's eyes widened in surprise, hearing that he would become a secret weapon that appeared out of nowhere. The man sighed and said that from the opponent's point of view, he was a dark horse. There was no information about him, so they would not be able to develop methods and strategies against the magic he used. The protagonist smirked and thought about this. So that's what it is. Because he was always the last one, no one looked at him. Unlike Jake, they had no data on him, so it would be easy to catch them off guard. The protagonist clenched his fist tightly, hearing that he would say whether he was going to participate. Looking straight ahead, Paul said that he would do his best to justify their trust. Someone knocked on the door, and the man said that it was just in time. Let him come in. Looking at the knight, the head of the academy said that he assumed it would be more useful for him to attend body art classes than magic. Especially for this, he invited a martial arts professor. The protagonist looked surprised and thought about this man, and then heard how the desperate student was doing. The knight, looking at the hero, asked what was wrong with his face, not happy to see him, to which the hero thought it was Fred. This is the leader of the Knightly Order of the Folden Territory, one of the 5 knights of the 6th rank, and the only one in the kingdom of Radian. The hero crossed paths with him during the 3rd stage of the practical exam. Sitting in front of the knight, the protagonist thought that who would have thought he would have the opportunity to receive instructions from him. Fred said that first he needed to confirm something. Looking straight ahead, the man claimed that, according to Professor Mike, he was a particular magician who was obliged to battle entirely at close range. When questioned whether this was true, the hero nodded and replied, "Yes, that's correct." The hero's battle was shown, and the man said that from the last time he could say that his attacks were pretty good, clear, and without unnecessary movements. The hero was surprised to hear that, but he had to be honest. It was too obvious that he had not studied martial arts properly. Sitting in front of the hero, the man said that his skills could work against the ogre, but a skilled knight would read him like an open book. No matter how strong he was, opponents, after his teachings, he would be able to progress beyond the fundamentals. And looking at the hero, Fred said, "Wow, why don't we start right now?" The castle wall appeared. The man said that the most important thing for a knight is his legs. They give strength to the sword and allow one to predict the enemy's actions. The hero walked straight, and the man said that only after that could he begin studying the art of the body. The protagonist slashed into the air several times. The knight watched the training, and looking straight ahead, Fred wondered why a memory surfaced of the protagonist saying that his training would not bring him any benefits. He would have to come to the academy every day, so why? Looking straight ahead, the hero heard that if an answer was needed, they would say that this was a kind of investment. To this, the hero asked again. The man closed his eyes and said that the hero bowed and stated that in such case he was at his service. Putting his palm to his face, Fred remarked that it was impossible to listen to this. It was becoming horribly embarrassing. Simply call him Fred. He was not even 30, to which the hero responded, "What the hell?" Character struck with his fist. The training process appeared, looking straight ahead. The man thought he was doing well. The guy was not lacking in endurance. The knight looked at the monster. It was heard that the ogre's jaw was broken. Fred, leaning on a tree, thought about how a melee mage was physically stronger than an ogre. What an interesting young man. 3 weeks passed like this. It was written that the level of the body art skill had been increased. The body art skill had reached level 10. The achievement of the whole body as a weapon had been received. As a reward, the effect of the madness mage skill had been improved. Now he could fill every part of his body with magic. The protagonist raised his hands in surprise, looking at Ted. The protagonist said that the effect of mastering the heavenly martial art was incredible. Yes, indeed. To which he replied that yes, thanks to this, he had advanced to rank 3. It was written that the strength was 2130, and the protagonist clenched his fist and said that he felt enormous strength. Sighing, the bear said that he was getting stronger surprisingly quickly. He had once gained 2,000 over more than a year and another 6 months after meeting him, to which the protagonist asked if perhaps it was due to the difference in the perception of time between a person and a dragon. The protagonist turned around, hearing that someone had addressed him. The hero was perplexed to hear that a list of participants in the great festival was posted at the entrance to the academy, which he mistook for the great festival at the entrance ceremony. They introduced new students and spoke from the stage, and as a result, they envied him and cast distrustful glances. Suddenly, everyone ran up, shouting that they congratulated him on the place of representative. He would speak on his behalf at the great festival. The hero smiled. It took a long time, but he became the representative of the academy. Again, looking straight, the professor said that he was surprised to hear from Sir Fred that he had mastered the celestial martial art. Looking at the hero, Mike said that to get the 5th class at 16 sometimes frightened him with his genius. The man grinned, adding that he believed that he could handle it. Preparations for the great festival went smoothly, after which they went to Altain, the place where the festival was held. In the crowd, they heard talk that they would take the mono train. He would ride it for the first time. He heard that it was incredibly fast. The hero closed his eyes, listening to the fact that in the kingdom of Radian, there are only 2 transit points. But they say that in the Imperial Federation of Reen, there are more than 100. Well, it is understandable. It is an empire, and a kingdom smaller than them is still to be found. The guys looked away in surprise, hearing that the redneck, as if he had never seen a train. Jason asked again, to which the guy replied that he should shut up and not embarrass himself. The protagonist looked away, listening to what he had said. The guy folded his arms, and the hero thought that this freak's name was Adam. Jake Sing-Along, who had taken part in the magic festival with him last year. Looking at Jason, the guy said that if he thought that Paul would work a miracle at the great festival, then he should not. He was proud, although he only got good grades for the first semester. The guy leaned slightly and said that for sure, representatives of other ACHEMs were like ghosts. They would have more chances if they chose Jake as the representative who had already fought against them. The guy angrily asked again, hearing that in any case they did not recognize Paul as their representative, so let them cope on their own. Looking away, the protagonist thought that many people strive to gain an advantage by somehow currying favor with Jake's family, but they are obliged to perform well even if someone does not agree with their candidacy. The guy was surprised to hear that Jake would be flattered. Grinning, Paul said that his dogs remain loyal even when the owner is thrown out of the academy. Looking at the hero, Adam asked what he called them, to which the protagonist replied that thank God he realizes that he deliberately expressed himself as clearly as possible so that even a person of your level of intelligence would understand everything. Standing in front of the hero, the guy said that only that he is a representative of the academy, and the hero interrupted him, saying that he should listen. The protagonist lowered his head and said that this festival would be a level higher than those he attended. He achieves good results in it, he will receive opportunities better than his connections with Jake's family could give him. The boy furiously shouted that of course this can only be said if they achieve something. Is it possible? Those who were chosen to participate in the festival are all monsters. In the end, their fate is to be stuck in the Radiant Kingdom and work under the leadership of the family. So let him come down to earth? The boy was surprised to hear that this was possible. Turning around, Paul said that the grand festival is one in which cooperation plays an important role, so it is better not to use those who interfere with teamwork. Looking at him, Adam asked what he meant by competing without them. Looking back, the protagonist replied that he suggests that they think about who their representative is now while they are on the way. The boy fiercely gritted his teeth when he heard that and also reminded them that there is no one from their family here to evaluate their loyalty. Looking at the hero, Adam furiously shouted that he should just try to lose in his first individual battle or he would not listen to a single command from him at the grand festival. The train moved forward rapidly. The students, looking around, said how fast it was. Standing on the hero's shoulder, Ted said that while the world has become a great place in his time, there were no such fast ways to travel. Suddenly the door swung open. The hero looked away, hearing that it seemed to him that he smelled losers. Standing at the end of the car, the guy asked who they had here. A country bumpkin from the academy. Looking at the guy's clothes, the protagonist wondered if this symbol was from the Oyota National Magic Institute, the only educational institution in Oyota, the same kingdom of the desert. It is known for its ancient history and is also famous for its reverence. The great festival was a competition for students, and at the time, the hero assumed that the professor would not stand up for him because the man was reading a book. The bear smiled and asked if he was too calm, saying that he didn't even bat an eyelid after such words. The hero took a few steps forward and approached the guy who said he was a representative from Oyota, and Charlie inquired about his. Then the hero added that this was enough for the first acquaintance. If he was finished with finding problems, then let him get out of their car, to which Charlie asked again, grinning. The main character said that although before that he would apologize for all the insults voiced right, in a polite manner. Paul clarified whether he would apologize for all the words spoken and asked again if he was right that he would do it in a polite manner. The bald man was angrily perplexed. He asked if he told him to apologize. He clarified with the brunette if he told his new representative anything about him, to which he did not know what to answer. The bald man shouted with a question about whether he could at least once do everything right, and added that he would hit him again so that he would remember it for the rest of his life. Paul realized what was going on here. He looked at them and realized that apparently the students who participated in the magic festival were trembling in his presence. Paul frowned and continued that it was because they were attacked by the melee set. Paul turned to the bald man and asked him if he didn't want to sort it out right away. He asked him again because he thought he was insane, and he went in with fists, clarifying that he thought he would cringe at such words and ask. The guy turns to Paul and says that he will deal with him later. The brunette looks after him and thinks that he thought so. It would not be easy from the beginning. He asks the professor why he stopped them. The bald man continues that he himself suggested this method to them and clarifies what changed. He exhales and asks again if he really did not notice, to which the bald man is perplexed. The professor says that he was smiling, which the bald man does not understand. The plot says that after a short showdown with that guy, the atmosphere in the car changed. People crowded around Paul and asked, what about the first battle? Because the first match will be a group competition without a representative. Someone asks if Paul will join him, and someone else asks if they can handle it. The brunette shouts that they can handle it and they simply have to win, to which the others say that this is true and they can't lose to these freaks. Paul, he asks what would have happened if he had not answered them. Against the background of the windows, he continues that they would only be happy and would have started to laugh at them even more. The guy convinces them that if he had kept silent, they would have fully justified the mocking nickname given to them, and asks again if this is what they want. The guy squints while he asks if they want to continue to tolerate such disrespect. He shouts that they allowed them to beat them up, and that is why they have been dragging them through the mud for 5 years in a row. Paul asks them what they are going to do and adds that he does not think that now is the time to fight, purely out of selfish delusions. The guy answers that he is thinking of leaving his friend at the gate and clarifies his opinion on this matter, to which he asks again if he is talking about him. The brunette crosses his arms over his chest and thinks that, judging by everything, MLS yes-men have decided to side with him, and realizes that they should maintain the same attitude until the very end. At the station, they announce that the next stop is the Du of Altine, to which the guys realize that they are there. Someone gives the command to take their things and leave. Against the background of the map, a voiceover tells about this Dewey, because it is a state that is part of the Imperial Federation, and only it is recognized as neutral in the Empire. On this land, they must put aside their emotions, even if they have been implacable enemies for decades. The knights are ready to fight back while he continues that if bloodshed occurs on the territory of Alai, then the Empire will hold a trial of the criminals in the person of the ruler of the continent and repay them for the atrocities they have committed. Promotions of empires. And he explains that due to this state of affairs, large-scale international competitions such as the upcoming Magic Festival for Magicians and the Sword Grand Prix for Swordmasters are held in this territory. People are stunned, and someone asks if this is the same empire, to which someone tells him that he is an idiot and that this is not an empire but an imperial federation under the control of the empire. He asks again what the difference is. The blonde says that everything is completely different here, and asks Paul for his impressions. But he continues that he comes from a territory that is considered a fairly rich region, but he simply cannot compare it to this place. The brunette looks ahead and thinks about this Imperial Federation, looks at the locals, and thinks that this is what one would expect from the capital of a kingdom. The girls laugh, and he continues that noble antiquity blows from everywhere and the residents carelessly walk the streets. He looks around and thinks that this sight once again makes it clear that they came from a very small place. A chariot pulls up, and someone says that they are now heading to a place of temporary residence and asks to get into the carriages. The man in glasses continues that he hopes none of the plot shifts to the Ignite Academy, where the blonde sleepily asks Paul where he is going and if he is going on a date. The guy looks surprised, and the bear adds that a very interesting smell is coming from there. Ted jumps off, looks ahead, and tries to compare it to something. The bear imagines the creature and replies that a relic of a dragon is located here. The guy opens the door. Paul says that he thought the item used by the black dragon himself would be in a more unusual place, and adds that it is somehow too ordinary. He imagines greedy people and thinks that he previously imagined he would end up on the black market or a rich man's warehouse, and Ted replies that the draft relic is useless for maesters who do not use power-based magic, and for them, that item will become equal to ordinary trash. Paul uses the ability of the player's eyes. A huge source of light illuminates everything. Paul looks at the spark ahead. A pop-up window notifies him that he has a ring of invulnerability in front of him. It is an exclusive artifact of the player. The player continues that it is the first artifact created by the fight, but also his first failure, and that using the power of invulnerability, it also increases the chance to nullify all physical damage. Ted clarifies that there is one nuance. He continues that it is not only about attacks. Resistance will arise even from the touch of a friend or the embrace of a loved one. Paul listens carefully that the effect may not activate when it is really needed, and at the same time calmly work on something ordinary, there for the failure. Nevertheless, the guy needs it, to which he agrees. The window notifies that there was an increase in strength by 200 points, and this alone is worth putting on The guy puts the ring on his finger. He understands that it sits on him like a glove and as if it was created for him. Paul approaches the seller and says that he would like to buy this ring and asks how much it will cost. Grandpa shakes his head and says that he can just take it because it has been lying there for many years and he did not even know what to do with it. The brunette says that in this case, he will take something else from him, to which he replies that he does not mind. Paul says that the player's eye is indeed a very useful skill. He looks at the objects in the room and can determine their quality, saying that you can even determine the value of an object. He notices something in front of him. Paul sees a book with a high rarity rating. It is about quantum mechanisms of magic and swords, and he realizes that he needs it. The guy runs to it, but the blonde intercepts her. Paul looks at her with displeasure. The brunette sees a fifth-class mage in front of him. Her potential is estimated to be very high and recognizes her as Irene from the Women's University. He thinks about the dirty king known as the King of Magicians and the King of the Border. The girl is standing behind the crowd. He continues that he chose 11 magicians who should represent the next generation, and she is among them. Paul thinks that he heard that she is a genius close to reaching the 5th level. She frowns ahead while he continues that she is already a 5th-class mage, and it turns out that the rumors even underestimated the reality. The girl asks him to give her the book, to which she receives in response that he touched her first. She replies that, judging by the symbols on his uniform, he is from the academy and tells his name and where she is from, and adds that he found what he was looking for, and now he decided to find something else to buy while she came specifically for this book. The guy solemnly listens to the proposal that if he does not care, could he give it to her? He understands that she overheard everything, and this is because they are both participating in the great festival. Paul asks in this case to answer him why she needs the book, because such books are not just looked for. The girl is confused, trying to come up with a plausible answer. She looks away and answers that this is part of her individual assignment, and she cannot devote him to the details and asks not to ask her about it. The guy understands that this is unlikely from the educational institution and wonders if this could be an order from the king. Paul gives her the book, to which she does not believe what she heard, and he explains that she said it is important to her and offers her to take it. The girl thanks him. She watches him looking for a new object to buy. The blonde doesn't know what to say. Someone asks Paul if he met Irene and what they talked about, and asks if she is really as beautiful as they say. The blonde asks where and under what circumstances he met her, to which Paul asks them to ask at least in turn. The blonde replies that he is very jealous because he dreams of touching her hand at least once, and he is perplexed by what kind of dreams he has. The guy bursts out laughing and notes that his interlocutors are incredibly pathetic and that he also saw her at the great festival and even sat next to her during it. But he is interrupted by a question whether he spoke to her. The guy is perplexed and asks again whether he crossed paths with her at least once. Another brunette continues that in any case, that girl is strong but always takes second place, and he heard that she is terribly worried about eternal losses to the first place. To this, the blonde clarifies what kind of nonsense this is and how dare he speak like that about his Irene. Paul crosses his arms, not understanding when she began to belong to someone, and replies that this is not nonsense at all because we are talking about number 1 in the special school of combat magicians, from which it follows that he is the most recognized among all his peers on the continent. The brunette clarifies that he also has a shining sword, and Paul is perplexed. The guy realizes that he understands the reason why the girl wanted to get that book so much, in order to defeat that swordsman. He continues that, however, it is not so cool to be a magical swordsman because a magical sword, in comparison with other weapons, does not provide a pronounced increase in magic, and besides, becoming a skilled master of the sword is also not so easy. The brunette adds that the first place has always been different from the others. The shining sword is a high-class artifact, and his level of swordsmanship is at least the same as the average knight, if he is not mistaken. The blonde frowns and continues that he has an artifact, good swordsmanship skills, and a talent for magic. Yes, he will die of envy from such geniuses, because on top of that, there is also a good, wealthy family and good looks. His popularity among girls is simply off the charts. While Paul is thinking, he continues that he did not think that such people even exist. The brunette thinks about the girl because at 16, she became a 5th level mage, and her opponent is a magical swordsman who defeats her every year. He thinks that if he fights against these famous geniuses, will he be able to win? Paul remembers the incident on the train, saying that he is definitely someone no one considers a threat, but nevertheless, grandfather says that he is more than worthy of being considered a candidate for victory. The boy frowns and thinks that he wants to make sure that his words are true. Someone bursts in, shouting that it is time for the first team to gather outside for the opening day of the great festival. Paul braces himself. He stands up and walks towards the door. His mind is spinning around the upcoming festival. He realizes that it is starting. It is time for the opening matches of the great festival. Paul looks away, thinking about his opponents. No one could understand why their first opponent after the academy, everyone was surprised at their easy victory. The boy laughs, answering that he was lucky that they fell first. Paul angrily understands that these were the worst opponents for them, that these guys were always known for their dirty play. The protagonist also answers that many in the academy were traumatized by interacting with them. The hero stands up and shouts that his name is Paul and that he is a representative of the so-called After Academy, which everyone is discussing here. The guy looks forward with displeasure, and the main hero asks not to call them that because it is unpleasant. The hero immediately remembers Bob. Paul confidently answers that he is a secret weapon who will no longer retreat. Everyone begins to talk about this guy. The guy asks Paul if he could handle the throw Mona grenades, a team competition in which everyone except the representative throws mana-filled grenades at a mithril golem. The team that destroys their golem the fastest wins. The hero agreed that they lacked talented students. The guy knew how to win. Paul understood that this was a group competition, so if they worked together, the hero took a close look at Paul, and he knew he was going to do everything he could to get them to be first, not last. The hero realized that while those guys were throwing one grenade, theirs needed to throw 2 or 3, giving them more time. The team was led by the girl walking, who, the beaten hero, exhausted and on the ground, began to call Paul, who was perplexed as to who had done this to him. The heroes were sitting on the couches when the door opened and Paul began to enter. The main one responded that the hero, perplexed, asked Paul why he was acting so impudently and confidently, and he began to call one of the guys to come to him. Voices were heard from their building. Charlie laughed, shouting that the hero was insane. The hero touched the guy's shoulder. His hand began to squeeze more and more. Charlie fell to his hunches in displeasure. The hero did not understand what Paul had just allowed himself to do. Charlie quickly stood up and began to point his fist at. The hero yelled that it was time for them to go to the Altane Stadium where the Festival of Magicians was being held. Charlie was lying on the ground in pain, and the hero was enraged. Paul smiled at him and asked if he wanted to make a bet. If they won, Charlie would get a flick on the face as well as an apology. Paul recognized that he had been part of the festival in which legends were produced. The man screamed that the ceremony was done and that all of the pupils should return to their seats. The hero walked slowly forward. He began to look away. Charlie shouted discontentedly at Paul to be ready because this time he would not let down his guard. The guy looked at the hero who was slowly leaving. All attention was on the prime spirits. The guy was thinking about the winner of the Magic Festival, who is a leader in each discipline of the Special School of Combat Magicians. The hero was surprised that the girl said he even went into an open conflict by visiting the Institute house. The guy asked Margot how she knew all this. The hero laughed, answering that he did not go into conflict and just wanted to talk. Margot calmly replied that it was better for the guy not to stand out. The heroine looked at Paul in surprise, who asked her about hiding his true skills. As she did, Paul ran away, answering that he was taking part in. The heroes were taken aback by the division of the team into groups of warmers and throwers, which was unusual in magic competitions. The first competition began shortly after, and the team fled. Previously in team competitions, the team with the most outstanding members would win. The golem's right arm was shattered, and his teeth were clenched in rage as Charlie asked his team why they were being stupid and losing. After the academy, everyone was shouting that they were behaving unusually and that some people were healing the golem so it couldn't fall. The hero looked away with displeasure. Margot was very impressed. Everyone understood that the reason why the academy was winning was because of skills, which is where the strategy lied. The first competition, throwing the Minnow grenade, which was supposed to end with the Institute's victory. The guy was shouting loudly that it was all over now, and the entire golem was glowing with light and breaking into pieces. Charlie looked forward in fear, his face radiating anger, and the golem fell calmly to the ground. Ted smiled and asked the guy if he was worried. Paul calmly looked away and said that they were now the 20th out of 32 educational institutions, which was ideal. After the last victory, people began to show interest again, but it was still not enough to remove the label that had been attached to him because of the failures of the. For the guy, it was an overwhelming victory. Paul understood that if they had an overwhelming the hero smiled as he answered Bob's question about whether or not he was considered a useless child. Marana shifted his gaze away from Bob, stating that he used to think of him as a candidate for the next generation. The man shouted that they were starting the match, and Paul confidently answered that he would fight with his forehead. The duel began, and Charlie directed all his power, shouting that he would repay what had been done before. The summoning of the combat protector began, and the knight was fully armored. Paul began to use time reversal, and the hero quickly ran to the sides. Charlie looked ahead in confusion, and the hero looked away with displeasure. Paul stood next to him, holding a fist in his. Charlie clenched his teeth and yelled that he couldn't move. Paul, with a smile on his face, told him to try to leave on his own. The protagonist calmly replied to the guy that he didn't think it was time to just talk with him. The knight pointed his weapon at the guys, and Charlie screamed for him to stop. The hero approached Charlie and asked him if he had saved him, and Paul asked him how he could save the one who had bullied his classmate, to which the hero replied with a smile that he wanted to finish him off himself. Charlie was surprised that Paul had hit his steel protector with his bare hands, and the knight began to collapse. Morgan realized that he had arrived at the demigod stage, and that he was the sole mage of the 8th class, known as. Nonetheless, even he had never heard of such magic, and the eyes were scared. Morgan looked at the guy in surprise, not fully understanding who he was. The man was starting to get angry, and Morgan began to ask Bob to tell him everything he knew about the guy. Bob calmly answered that he was a model student who, according to everyone's expectations, should have given up but fought to the end. The hero, with a smile on his face, asked if they could exchange a few words. Morgan began to think about calling him himself and then asking him directly. Bob looked away. The man knew that he would have to be stopped. Morgan asked the guy what he was going to remind him of, about the fact that magicians have the right to keep their techniques secret. The guy smiled and poured Paul's drink, which he knew would make him feel like he had shared a kiss with a dragon. Paul was surprised by the dragon's kiss, which was already on the table, but the hero laughed and explained that it was Paul's drink from his territory. The guy angrily asked Charlie to leave him alone. The hero sadly replied that he had come to ask for forgiveness, which surprised everyone. The hero asked the team to forgive him for always looking down on him. Charlie sadly replied that after losing, he realized that he shouldn't consider others inferior to him just because they were weaker. The hero calmly replied that there were many people in this world who were stronger than him. Charlie apologized for ruining the atmosphere, and the hero turned around. Paul asked if Charlie's feelings were genuine, and the hero sadly replied that they were. Paul smiled, and the boy thanked Charlie for having the courage to apologize. The hero looked at the floor, where 2 hands were shaking. The other boys also accepted the boy's apology, and they all began celebrating together, dangling their arms over each other. The boys asked Paul if he was awake, and he rubbed his head tiredly. They asked him if he remembered what happened yesterday, and the heroes replied that Paul was screaming and thanking them for believing in him. The boys laughed, not believing that the hero had such a side. Paul did not understand what they were doing, but he did understand that he should no longer drink a drink that makes you overly emotional. The professor asked the man to be cautious because Morgan was a complete secret, and the man replied that he was always in trouble. The professor responded that the head of the academy appeared concerned, and Paul was surprised to learn that it was Morgan. Paul quickly left. Arrow Ball is a game in which 9 players are divided into teams of attackers and defenders, and the ball plays the role of a living arrow constantly flying around the field. The hero confidently answered that he understood everything, and the entire group of people laughed and yelled at Paul. The hero smiled and replied that they now had another reason to win. The hero yelled, "It all began," and the hero dashed forward, directing an ice tree, an ice spear, and a wall of fire as they fought each other. Some used defensive spells, others used crowd control magic. and no one knew how to grab the arrow ball and send it into the goal, among other things. The team looked at their leader in surprise, not understanding what had happened. Yesterday, he was hysterical because of the loss, and now he was shouting at Paul. One of the guys laughed, and everyone looked at Charlie with incomprehension. The hero looked ahead, knowing that after the match, he was convinced that Paul was a next generation man. The hero was enraged, saying that they should be wary of more than just Paul, and everyone yelled that they needed to stop the guys because they had grabbed the team's defense collapsed, and the academy won the game with a stunning margin of 11 points. The heroes laughed, realizing that they could be the first to win, and the team immediately admitted defeat. The professor approached Paul, and he was like, Morgan looked away, and the man told the guy not to eat anything and wait for the meeting. Paul confidently walked forward, and someone began to call the guy to himself. Bob, smiling, asked Paul if they would go in together. The two heroes entered the room, and Paul looked away in surprise. Vegan was sitting on the throne, and Ted asked if he was a monster. Paul understood that the hero was a magician standing on the border between a man and a demon, filthy King Morgan. The hero stated that he had a chance to observe him. Morgan replied that it had been 5 years since he chose 11 children, and Paul was one of the candidates. The hero decided to get straight to the point, and Morgan asked the hero to explain what was going on with him. Paul understood that the hero's words completely coincided. The hero understood that Morgan wanted to hear him and that he was not mistaken. Morgan looked at the guy who responded. Morgan decided to see if Paul's efforts would help him stand up against the children he had chosen, and Paul smiled and told him to keep an eye on them. The hero was also interested in the art of the body, which Magran had studied to help him overcome his disorder. Morgan smiled at Bob and replied that he was always glad to have talented magicians and that simple curiosity was bothering him. Bob asked the guy in surprise if he had been able to satisfy him. Morgan calmly answered that something had pushed this question into the background. Bob calmly replied that Paul was young and that he should not be treated harshly. The demigod was surprised that the guy was not afraid of him at all, and that most of the others would have. The hero's hands were clenched, and he was enraged that the hero had met someone other than himself. The hero asked if he was sure about it, and everyone calmly replied that Paul had actually visited the Mag Tower. The hero responded that he had seen some matches with his participation and that this man had everyone on their ears. The heroes looked away. One of the guys hit the wall with all his might. The hero, with all his anger, could not forgive Paul because only he was worthy of the recognition of the King of Magicians. The door opened. All calmly looked forward. A silhouette stood in front of him. Chuck looked at the guy with displeasure. The hero, gritting his teeth, asked the guy about what he had talked about with the Dirty King. Paul asked the guy if he had waited for him just for this. Chuck's eyes were filled with dissatisfaction as the guys used force on each other. The guy calmly responded that they were not at a tournament, and Chuck yelled that he urgently needed to hear an answer. Paul stood in his stance, realizing that the guy had a murderous aura. In a moment of confusion, Paul asked the girl if Doom Prime always behaved the way he wanted, and the heroine laughed, saying that he usually doesn't say anything. A girl stood next to them, and the guys replied that it was cool that they were all in one place, and Paul was already thinking about how to introduce himself. Chuck quickly began to leave. The heroine asked Paul if he was serious about planning a fight, and Paul laughed, saying that they probably just told him to scare him. Paul understood that Chuck was like a thick wall that could not be broken through with a regular attack, but he didn't think he would lose because no matter how thick the wall was, it would fall in a few hits. Margot laughed and said that he was a strange guy. The hero left, and the girl answered. After a while, the heroes asked the guy what his plan was, since it was soon time for an individual fight. Paul laughed, saying that everyone was great and everyone worked hard. The hero laughed, saying that he had to stay on top. At the time, the guy was striving for first. The hero was surprised to learn that the Amor representatives were actively forming alliances in order to survive the upcoming battle, and that dividing all allies and opponents, as well as forming strong groups, is considered an effective tactic. Points would be awarded based on performance quality, so changes in the ranking were unavoidable. The hero, with a smile on his face, realized that he could trust Charlie as a team member. Paul yelled at Charlie that he needed to leave as soon as possible to team up with one more person. Charlie looked at the group of people with Paul who were angry and looking ahead. There was a Canis on the bench. Charlie asked Paul if he wanted to invite Margot, one of the strongest candidates. The guy was surprised that he would be on a team with Margot herself. Guy with a smile, the girl suggested, starting the meeting by discussing the plan. The guy stood at the table looking at the plan. Paul asked the girl if the largest alliance included 14 people. The girl confidently answered that the entire group had gathered around the magic school. The hero answered that he mainly used holy magic and light magic. Charlie knew that they would not take him by numbers because his group would get on their nerves the most. Paul understood. Everyone asked the guys if they had put on their equipment. The guy answered with a smile that if its durability was exhausted, it would be automatically excluded from the competition. Then there would be teleportation from the island. The ship was sailing on the sea, and a team of people began to emerge from it. Charlie answered fearfully that they were all on pins and needles. The ladies understood that they needed to survive for 72 hours. In the forest, Charlie tiredly touched his stomach, asking Paul if they could buy food. The hero shouted that they were a team, and Charlie looked away with displeasure. Then there was an explosion in the forest, and Paul told them that it was now their turn. The heroes stood behind a tree. The guys shouted to each other in fear of not having a place to eat. All of the force passed through the territory. The whole team directed their magic. Charlie looked around, realizing that this was a real ambush, and laughed, saying that he had been waiting for this moment. An iron sphere traversed the territory. The hands were joined, and Margot was focusing her power toward the men. Paul recognized that it was 5th grade ice magic. A blizzard started. Charlie was shocked that he couldn't expect anything less from Margot, who had conjured such powerful magic without breaking a sweat. The guy was taken aback and used his power, peering ahead in horror. The other team firmly announced that there were 3 guys present. One of them was Margot. The heroes tried to shove him. Paul recognized that their opponents were really powerful magicians. The hero realized that it was his turn to act. The team couldn't figure out what that sound was. The man looked away. The hero was taken aback and wondered how he dared to do such a thing. The magic quickly flew right into Paul's face. Fear gripped the hero as he realized it was a time refraction. The entire crew was concerned since they didn't know who was going where. Paul was gritting his teeth. All of the heroes were fighting one another. One of the guys chose to use the binding tree. The hero held a massive fireball in his hands. The guys were yelling that it was explosive mana and they needed to dodge. The hero made a speedy getaway. Charlie yelled at Paul to finish it immediately. Paul dashed at one guy, clutching a fireball in his hands. A massive explosion ripped through the entire woodland. The hero lay on the ground, confused and unmoving. Everything around him started to burn with blazing flames. Paul remained calm while he watched. The crew rushed up to the hero, attempting to say something. Paul boldly informed the man that now there were 3 of them against 4. The lads gritted their teeth in disgust. Paul smiled as he questioned the squad if they had bought enough food. Food fell from the backpack. The girl shouted, "There was even meat here." They were taking food from their suitcases. Charlie remarked that they had brought enough food to last them around 3 days. Paul agreed. His friend praised the players, saying they would be able to enjoy the feast. Suddenly, there was a massive explosion behind him. The lads looked around. Charlie inquired whether David's group was traveling in that direction. Whoever the attackers were, they had the courage to confront a group of more than 10 people. Margot folded her arms over her chest and declared it was Chuck. There weren't many mages with that much mana. The guy observed with joy that in the year that they hadn't met, he had grown more stronger. He even got goosebumps. Paul grimaced, thinking, yes, Chuck is really strong. The sun was shining through the open door into the room. There were multiple beds and closets within. Margot entered and noticed no signs that the others had arrived earlier. Paul suggested that they take a break and get a snack. Charlie was pleased. In 1 minute, he would introduce them to the flavor of a Yoda steak. The hero approached him and explained that the stench could give them away. For the time being, they should avoid eating meat. The man looked back. The girl questioned how he knew. He looked forward thoughtfully and stated that everything he had foreseen was coming true. Paul claimed that the center village was the only site on the island where a big group of people could seek refuge. David would probably go there, and he said Chuck would too. Margot threw up her hands and objected, stating that he would go there alone, despite the fact that he would be facing the largest team. Wasn't it too dangerous a venture? The man responded that Chuck would appear there because that was the easiest way to win alone. She explained that the girl trembled when she learned about kill points. The hero said that Chuck would earn points for each enemy he eliminated. Such a way of thinking is entirely consistent with his spirit. He was uncomfortable and said, well, he was just thinking about what he would do in his place. He also believed that Chuck had no choice but to take a risk in order to get the Dirt King's attention. Margot placed her palm on her chin, leaned towards Paul, and stated that he was suspicious. The hero said, all right, and volunteered to create a duty schedule. The female volunteered first. The moon lit up the night sky. He opened his eyes and turned his head. Margot asked him to wake up. He sat upright. The girl mentioned that they had a guest. He drew back the curtain to peek out the window. Paul observed someone in a hooded cloak in the window. The gentleman turned to the girl and asked whether she counted how many of them there were. She responded that there was just one and terminated the light magic. To avoid detection, it is unlikely that he is aware of their presence. The hero peered out the window and realized he was on his way here. He explained that Charlie needed to be roused up and that he would protect the entrance in case the stranger approached the house. He neared the door, and the hero hid behind the wall, squatting down. The individual reasoned that if only one person was involved, it could be him. The stranger began opening the door. He walked forward, and Paul grabbed him by the hood of his robe, throwing him forward forcefully. He covered his mouth so he couldn't talk. The girl extended her hands ahead and yelled, "Light!" Charlie, who approached the company, recognized him. He said, "A representative of the academy, Callie." Paul withdrew his hand. The player apologized, stating that he was not planning to break in. He was simply seeking for a place to rest, and if he had known they were inside, he would not have entered. Paul sternly inquired if he was alone. He said yes. Charlie gazed outside the window. The hero continued the interrogation, asking where his squad members were. It appeared to him that there were 6 of them. CA, said Chuck, adding that he had eliminated them. CA stated that at the start of the test, they were pushing forward confidently because their coalition was large. They were planning to ambush David's group and score kill points when Chuck emerged. He went after him, the group that scattered, to look for food. Margot clarified, he wants to say that Chuck eliminated a group of 6 people on his own? The man responded, no, he only eliminated 1, because they immediately went on the defensive. The true trouble began once David heard the blast. He focused his entire squad on them. They furiously defended themselves but did not hold out. Just 2, including him, survived and escaped. However, this wasn't the end. Chuck reappeared right in front of them. Callie gritted his teeth and continued his story. He began by fighting them, then hid and waited for the combat to end before following those who managed to flee. Although with injuries, Paul listened to him with a serious expression on his face, believing Chuck had studied the matter correctly and acted in his best interests. He understands how to benefit. Callie timidly added that he would like to ask, which is quite impudent of him, if they could take him into their team. Charlie was astonished. He placed his palm on his chin and observed that, despite his exhaustion, this man thinks like a strategist. Friends' faces changed when Paul said no. Margot questioned why. The hero inquired as to how Callie had managed to escape. He exclaimed, and Paul grimly said that if they were talking about Chuck, he would never leave him alone, even if he was wounded. Charlie raised his finger and exclaimed, "Really?" The young man went on to say that there were 3 possibilities. Either he was lying, or Chuck had spared him on purpose and was now hiding somewhere to observe the scenario. He expanded his eyes wide, which flashed blue, and stated that if a notice occurred, identification was impossible. The hero swung his fist and stated that this proves he is not Callie after all. An owl flew up from a nearby tree, disappearing and leaving behind smoking ashes. The girl questioned a puppet. Paul told his pals to hurry. They approached the open door. They needed to go right away. The setting sun's rays highlighted the mountain peaks as the group traveled through the woodland. Paul assumed that Callie was most likely removed by the same person who made the puppet. Thus, there is a good chance that all members of his group were eliminated. Margot realized that what the puppet stated could be true. The boys gazed at her. She realized she had someone in mind who could achieve this. The girl scowled and screamed, "Austin!" She added that he, as one of the 11 selected children, is the best student at Delinea College of Magic and has excelled in inventing potions and puppets, among other things. He is part of David's group. Paul touched his mouth with his finger and explained that they are now encircled by adversaries on all sides. He stated that he is certain, since Austin found them with the help of a puppet. Following that, other teams will announce a quest for them. However, the girls saw that the western section of the island would soon become inaccessible as the barrier narrowed. She asked Paul if he had any suggestions. The guy threw his knapsack over his shoulder and replied, "There is a saying from the waters of the Mazarat Ocean. Use pirates to fight pirates." He looked around with a confident smile and stated that they must catch opponents while also fighting opponents. In one of the houses, Austin was asked if he had discovered their location, and the man covered his face with his palm and said that they were hiding in the western half of the island like rats. I almost made it out with them, but at the last minute he was exposed. The leader wondered how his puppet had been revealed. Austin laughed heartily, shrugged, and replied that he had no idea. He did not even doubt. He suddenly struck with all of his strength, and that was it. David put a finger to his lips. The magician inquired as to his intended course of action. The leader believed that Margot, Charlie, and Paul were all difficult opponents. He turned away and forcefully stated, "We need to grab them and direct all combat power at them." The woodland was peaceful, and CM Team David took a tiny trail. The commander turned back and stated that they will soon be at the western base. In the distance, the players noticed a dazzling burst of light and lightning. Austin squinted and claimed there appeared to be a war going on. How loudly they were fighting. David reasoned that Paul must be present. The athletes rose into the air. The leader said, "Go ahead, it's time to earn points." They arrived and were greeted by a 3-person team. One of them shouted at the others to turn back. It was an ambush. David drew his bow and exclaimed, "Holy arrow!" He froze in astonishment, believing it wasn't Paul. A pillar of light rose up. The hero and his companions were sitting in a tree. Margot exclaimed, "It is holy magic." David assumed everything was going according to plan. Charlie laughed pleasantly. All the creatures fled as soon as they heard the fireworks, and they weren't even present. The girl inquired as to what their next step should be. Paul stood up and explained that they needed to go there to acquire kill point. David noticed a bright light behind him. A huge explosion was heading directly at them. He turned around and was immersed in smoke. Ooh. One of the players lay on the ground. A blond man called to David that Paul had arrived. Margot saw that the number of opponents had decreased. It appeared that the report about Chuck was accurate. Charlie claimed they were still outnumbered. They noticed 3 persons behind them. Charlie smiled, knowing that this was only a temporary alliance, but it was worth a shot. David hurried forward, calling to the others. "Even when they are united, there are only 6 of them. Do not hide in an attack." Paul avoided the fire onslaught. Flames enveloped one of the contestants on all sides. A column of fire erupted up close. The strike pushed one of the players back, leaving a furrow on the earth. The heroes were surprised. Charlie exclaimed, "This power!" Paul was stunned when he learned it was Chuck. The magician flew between the 2 groups, striking them with a sword. Charlie expressed fear that by taking these moves, he was signaling that they would now be on his side. Margot noticed that their short partnership seemed to have been refreshed. The hero cast a glance to the side, assuming Chuck wanted to get rid of David's group because all of the survivors had collected here. Perhaps they would soon learn the conclusion of the game. The opponents fled, screaming that he was only attacking them and that everyone should return to base. David told them not to flee, but to band together and fight back. The hero clenched his fists and declared that they, too, must make their move. Glowing elements appeared around the guy's eye as he employed time refraction. A ray of light zigzagged through the audience. Ball swung his fist and said, "How dare you?" He dropped to the ground and yelled. The young man looked up. Chuck jumped to the ground in front of him. He moved towards him, and when they met, he addressed Paul by name. The magician said with a grim and severe expression that he would dispose of him with his own hands. He dashed forward, holding a blade in his hands. The hero sighed deeply. Later, in the organizer's room, the heads gathered around the table. Bob stated that the top 10 finalists had been decided. Morgan noticed, yes, all those who were supposed to be included. He raised his head with his hand and asked Paul whether he had pledged to prove that he was superior to the 11 chosen youngsters. He stated that he was curious himself. He considered whether he could vanquish this guy. Meanwhile, at a modest home among the trees, Paul was jogging around and swinging his arms. They settled in Base B, which is near the island's center. Following the latest battle, only David and Austin remained from the largest coalition. Chuck and a group of survivors who had temporarily become allies vanished. A window displaying information on a repeated job appears in front of the hero. The gentleman screamed, "Great. For the first time in a long time, I managed to complete it." He spun at the house's door open. Margot smiled shyly as he asked whether she was already awake. The girl inquired whether he had been training. Paul responded, "Yes, my entire body was itching," which astonished him. Even after what had happened, she stated that Charlie had left his part and needed to eat. She would stop by soon. He'd thank her. Margaret picked a large chunk of steak and chewed into it with relish. Paul, who entered the house, inquired whether it was delicious. "Yes, Charlie turned out to be a surprisingly good cook," the girl stated. She explained that she went to bed without saying anything and asked for pardon. The guy said that it wasn't worth it. She was probably exhausted from being on duty. She poured tea into a cup as the man sat down at the table. Margot turned to face him. He gazed at her. The girl explained that she had been wanting to ask something for a long time. He clarified what exactly. She clenched her hands and inquired earnestly about his post-graduation plans. Paul responded by asking why she was intrigued. Margaret said that it was typical curiosity. His approach seemed incredibly distinctive, so she assumed he would not follow the standard way either. The girl said that once the mages who competed here joined society, they began to coexist in symbiosis. They may join a nocturnal order in their home country, protect it as a member of the Empire's army, work for the Mage Tower, or join a special group to gain money. All of these were the standard paths. The boy peered into his cup of tea and pondered. What about him? He folded his arms and claimed he had no idea. He hadn't even considered it yet. Paul admitted that until this year, he had been the worst student and couldn't waste time worrying about the future because he was mostly concerned about whether he would ever become a magician at all. He sighed and grinned, adding that he was confident that following this competition and return to the academy, a handful more ideas will emerge. Yes, Margot, how about you? She said, "To be honest, I don't know yet." The girl looked down and said she wasn't sure what kind of mage she should be. She always did what people told her, such as, "Margot, you should become a great mage." She took a sip of tea. Paul frowned. That's what the girl meant when she placed the cup on the table and went on. With a frightening grimace on her face, she stated that she would first like to attack Chuck. She added that it seems like after that, she would know what type of mage she wanted to be. The guy reflected on it. The fight with Chuck, for Margot, who had always finished second, had become a mountain to climb, a kind of schoolwork that needed to be completed. He grinned slightly and said, "Okay, so be it." Paul admired her ambition. He believed that everyone has difficulties that need to be solved. The girl said, "Thank you." The moon glowed in the gloomy night sky. The heroes gazed outside the window. Mar stated that the barrier was closing rapidly and that they needed to depart within an hour. Paul held a map in his hands. Charlie stated that in this event, the only safe place to spend the night would be Bassa in the central settlement. The girl went on to say that if we presume David and Austin are sheltering there, seizing the village is not a terrible idea. The hero warned them that Chuck might be waiting for them there. Charlie blocked the window with heavy curtains and instructed them to wait until more joined the struggle. Somehow, Margot agreed, then we'd be in danger due to the barrier. She inquired about other options. Charlie placed his hands behind his head and recommended they assault themselves. Paul stood with a frown. The girl said that they should avoid attracting attention so everyone is on guard. He agreed. The friends looked around. The hero halted them and stated that he had one suggestion. The person spread his arms out and stated that there were just a few people left at this point. Simply moving up one position would get them a lot of points. As Margot had stated, everyone would proceed with caution. Charlie listened closely. Furthermore, Paul stated that because they had already drawn the enemy's notice by making noise this morning, it was highly unlikely that most would react to every rustle, the girl inquired. So what? The hero responded enthusiastically, stating that this was their chance to get Chuck. He stated that David and Austin had lost members of their team today. The survivors, the weakest of all, would hide, but Chuck would undoubtedly turn up since he was confident in his talents. He also stated that if they left him alone, they would find themselves in a bad situation. The girl inquired hesitantly, but where should we look for him? Paul placed his palm on his chest and answered that they should leave it to him. He would guide him there. The star created a tornado of light. Ted, who was sitting on the hero's shoulder, inquired as to how he would locate Chuck. Looking at the mini-map, the person said that they could determine how many individuals were within the base. He sank to the ground and charged forward. A blue screen was burning ahead. If there were 3 of them, there were survivors. If just 2, David and Austin were present. Chuck would obviously be present. A red dot emerged on the map. The guy exclaimed, "I found it!" He paused in front of the home. Paul approached the door and menacingly demanded that Chuck come out immediately. An explosion rang out, knocking down the front door. A silhouette materialized in a dense cloud of smoke. Chuck, his eyes filled with wrath, shouted, "You?" Paul inquired coldly. Had he slept? He said they needed to go somewhere. The comrades were waiting for the leader on the street. When Charlie spotted Paul and Chuck, he shouted with dread. They grabbed him. The guy grabbed, and it was he who brought him here. Charlie was perplexed. He had brought him, but why? He had to follow him down in secret and plan an ambush. Paul felt humiliated. He hadn't intended anything like that. He turned to Chuck and stated that he would not be the enemy. The guy looked at the girl and said, "But, Miss Margot." Charlie was perplexed. He couldn't grasp what was going on. Chuck exhaled, crossed his arms across his chest, and asked Margot if she was his opponent. The girl replied, "Yes, perhaps she was." The magician said that if she were gone right now, the nasty king would be upset. She should wait a little longer to improve her rank. He was taken aback by her harsh response. She yelled, "This was not my goal in this competition." The girl summoned a magical ball of light and declared that destroying him was her goal. During the discussion with Chuck, Paul explained that the female was strong but always came second. He learned that she was quite concerned about eternal loses to first place. He said that this was part of his unique assignment and that he couldn't dedicate his time to the intricacies. He asked not to inquire about it. Margot stated that following this, she seemed to realize the type of magician she wanted to be. To defend herself against the magical attack, the girl raised her hands forward, formed a glowing circle, pointed it at her opponent, and cried, "Blizzard!" Chuck held his blade out in front of him, and there was an explosion. Margot's eyes widened. A crimson energy sphere appeared around Chuck, with fissures on the surface. The sphere collapsed, and flames erupted from Chuck's eyes. The girl clenched her teeth, and beads of sweat poured down her face. Charlie, who was standing close, asked Paul whether it was okay for them to simply stand and observe. Paul furrowed his brow and closed his eyes. Chuck swung and struck again. The girl lifted her hands, horrified that she would be unable to dodge. The hero stood in front of her, shielding her from the approaching pillar of flames. The girl collapsed to the ground. The guy stated that he promised to let her fight Chuck, but they did not agree to him eliminating her. He smirked, adding that he couldn't risk losing his cherished colleague for the sake of triumph. The spell faded and the hero yelled at Chuck to let him join the fight. The magician scoffed and asked, "Alone or with that small fish?" Charlie angrily exclaimed that the opponents were facing each other. Paul said that it was not cool for him alone to go 2 against 1. He looked at his comrades. Charlie asked Margot whether she was all right. The hero considered what he had learned. Frederick taught him how to fight an adversary with a sword. He remembered that the most important thing for a knight is his legs, which provide strength to the sword and allow him to predict the enemy's actions. The guy assumed a combat position, believing that if he closely monitored Chuck's legs, he would be all right. Chuck jumped on him. Paul realized he had touched the ground with his foot. He opened his eyes wide and thought, "Now." The hero stooped and quickly avoided the sword stroke. He smiled happily, his face lighted by a flare of light. He opened his jaws in surprise as Chuck directed a beam of red energy at him. Drops of blood dropped to the floor. Paul gripped his shoulders. The man explained that he was not a knight, but a magician. The hero clenched his teeth and leaned forwards. Chuck said that many believe sword magicians are powerless because they are neither magicians nor knights. He raised his weapon and explained that they only believe such because they have never met a true sword magician. A cyclone of stone shards and earth raced directly at Paul. The man continued to strike, instructing Paul to try to reply. The guy ducked with difficulty. He believed he had never faced such an opponent. Previously, in battles with magicians, he attacked at their weakest point, when they used their spells. However, Chuck overcomes this disadvantage with his sword. The hero felt pressure on his leg and knew he couldn't move there. There was a wound on his leg, and the fabric of his pants was ripped. Chuck said that this was known as the trace of radiance. He gently approached the guy, explaining that his wound would ache with every movement and that, like Margot, he would eventually be unable to move a finger. The man narrowed his eyes and stated that they would now conclude this. A purple shaft of light erupted from the ground, and black wings materialized behind. He had a magic ball in his hands. Charlie and Margot opened their jaws in surprise. Paul was stunned. This is 5th grade natural magic. A blast of blue light sprang from the ground. Chuck exclaimed, "Katana wings!" The hit was sudden and powerful, and the heroes were pushed away. The magician continued to attack. Paul huddled behind a boulder, reflecting on what should be expected of a man who wins the magic festival every year. He's really strong. He tore a piece of cloth from his sleeve with his teeth and used it to bind his leg wound. Suddenly, he looked to the side and discovered a ring on his finger. Chuck stood in the midst of the earthen circle, charred by the explosion, muttered irritably, reflecting that he expected something from Paul but only received disappointment. The man looked out from behind the rock and agreed with him. He stepped in front of Chuck and informed him he was strong. So strong that it appeared as if there was an impassable barrier in front of him. The man clarified that he intended to convey that he had given up. Paul smiled evilly. He said no, he couldn't do it. He extended his hand, revealing a ring on his finger, and stated that many people believed in him, which fueled his desire to destroy him even more. Chuck grinned and claimed the guy was crazy. He took the sword in his hand and promised to teach him a lesson such that he would never open his mouth again. The hero raised his arms and exclaimed, "Ogre Fury!" Waves of flame erupted around him. He advised Chuck to keep an eye on his chin as they approached one another. The magician swung his sword and exclaimed, "Who would talk? If he doesn't dodge, he might actually die." But the man clenched his teeth. He landed a light hit. Chuck's face was strained as he tried to withstand the attack. The sword struck the stone on the ring, but did not damage it. The blue panel stated that by exercising the power of invulnerability, there is a slim probability of surviving any physical force that strikes the body. The force caused the blade to split into pieces. A hit to the shoulder caused the sword to fracture. Paul shifted his focus to his opponent. The man gritted his teeth and demanded, "How?" The protagonist then hit him on the leg. The man fell. Chuck glanced at him with amazement. Paul opened his mouth and stated that he wanted to say one thing. Then he strained his vision and noted that he had no enemies. His failure was due to his arrogant notion that no one could beat him. Then he swung. Chuck opened his mouth, only to be struck by lightning. Paul examined the burning body. Charlie placed his palm on his chest and noticed that his heart nearly jumped out of. If he had lost, he would not have stood a chance. Paul explained that he was only lucky that he did not lose, and the protagonist looked at the girl, Margot, who stared down silently. Paul extended his hand and apologized for intruding in her conflict. The girl smirked and said she should ask for forgiveness, then bowed and added that her selfish wish endangered the entire squad. Asking for forgiveness, Paul gritted his teeth and stated that she was unable to reach her aim in this match due to him. Margot turned around and indicated that he should forget about this aim, which was no longer there. Then she turned and stated that she was no longer interested in Chuck before pointing to the protagonist and stating that she was interested in him. The main character smiled and stated that it would not be easy with him. Margot smiled and stated that she was prepared for this. Let him wait. She was determined to outperform him one day. The protagonist presented 2 magicians, believing that with them there were 5 contestants left. Diane and C.H. Harry fought with all of their might, but were unable to defeat their team. Then he presented two further magicians. A large explosion was heard in the woodland. Clouds of dust rose, and people lay comatose. The blonde was unconscious. The three warriors gazed at them. Paul smiled and observed that there were now only three of them, as if glued. Charlie said, "Who would have thought they'd go so far?" The protagonist opened his mouth and declared that if anything, he would not give them. But Margot placed her hand on her side and stated that she had given up at this point. Unfortunately, she was not in the best of health at the moment, but they would fight again when both were in better shape. Paul grinned and replied that he understood. They would consider it a promise. Then he realized it was quite understandable that Margaret was exhausted. Charlie grinned and announced that it was his turn. Paul, despite being the leader, would not back down so lightly. He had handled him leniently the previous time, but this time Paul lifted his fists and demanded that they begin immediately. A little later, Charlie swooped up and announced that he had requested to wait. The person opened his mouth and cried, "Long live the winners!" The warriors, as representatives of their academy, lifted their circles and cried, "We raised our circles!" for the protagonist. Paul turned to see that he was not in the dorm, so they assumed he would be here. Margot and Charlie were staring at the protagonist. The girl closed her eyes and stated that they could not miss the congratulations party in honor of the devastation with which they had both delight and grief. So they arrived here with Mr. The protagonist looked at them and told them that he was fencing himself off again because the competition was done. Only she decided how to address him, and the protagonist's eyes glittered as he assumed everyone was acting normally. After the survival war, he was the only winner. Chuck gained a lot of kill points, but his rank fell drastically due to a low number of survival points. After that, he remembered Chuck holding a shattered sword. Then he introduced Margot and mentioned the other contestants. Kate's for victory. Dean and Margot both fell below him. If he could keep the same spirit, winning would no longer be just a dream for the protagonist. The crowd hurled him over his head. Dean opened his mouth and exclaimed, "Who would have thought that he would sit at the same table with Margot? Now he can die." Then he jumped up, and it was stated that one should tremble once more for the goddess who descended on them. Let them not say so. Margot exited. The protagonist smiled at her. The sun hid behind the bar. The crowd stood in the building and asked, "Okay, how could Paul win?" Chuck glanced down and assumed he had lost. He then glanced at the sword and admitted that he had given in. He had not expected it to aim at his sword rather than at him. Then he remembered the conflict and realized that he had noticed it at the exact moment when he raised his blade in defense, but was unable to prevent it. He lost right in front of the filthy king. Chuck gritted his teeth. The person turned to face him and heard, by the way, the dirty king was not looking for him. He grinned and answered that there was no need to worry so much. Most likely he did not call him since he knew he was fatigued and needed to relax. Chuck realized he needed to be alone now. The guy rose up and said he was leaving now. Let him call if necessary. Chuck gazed at the locker before freezing. Confetti flew around the square as the audience chanted that Paul had defeated Chuck. The next generation of magicians was already present. Bob observed from the balcony before opening his eyes and realizing that he expected him to present his finest side. But who could have predicted such an impressive feat? To be honest, he never expected him to defeat Chuck. The man glanced at the elderly man and said that after Paul's victory, he couldn't stop smiling. It injured his pride as an organizer, and he couldn't look at that brat in the competition hall without crying. Bob turned around and inquired, "The competition hall? It turns out is already..." The men looked straight and noticed that this is exactly it. The great festival is coming to a close. The roaring throng in the stadium made Paul believe that the survival war had ended some days ago. Meanwhile, in the group competition, they finished fourth with a record of 5 victories and 2 losses. Unfortunately, they lost the battle for third place in the final game. But for them, known as the Academy, this was already something of a miracle. Only the final individual match remained, and the protagonist took a step forward. The protagonist's squad came to a stop. And then he glanced at the person and imagined he was an obstacle course on the outskirts of town, organized into 3 categories: sports, martial arts, and swimming. Because this is a war between magicians, you can either ride a summoned beast or use teleportation to travel through time and space. Charlie smiled and asked, "How does it feel?" Everyone shouting your name. The crowd opened their mouths and shouted, and Charlie inquired about how it felt to be the focus of attention in this tournament. Paul grinned and said it was difficult to say he still doesn't grasp how he feels. Then he strained his eyes and realized that, truthfully, he wanted to savor this incredible moment, but he couldn't yet. He then glanced at Chuck and said that it was too early to celebrate victory until there was a clear winner. The sun shone brightly. Marley folded his arms and stated that today was an individual competition and that he would not give up. Therefore, he should try to dodge. Paul responded, of course, he couldn't. The judge raised his revolver and yelled for everyone to prepare. The three warriors prepared, and then the rifle fired. The three warriors walked forwards. The crowd focused on the warriors' backs. The judge pointed his finger and instructed everyone to look. Paul stood near the wall, warming up. Then he smiled, and dust ascended from the ground. The three warriors charged forward. Margot looked ahead and remarked, by now, they should be tired, right? Mullen spread his arms and asked, by the way, why don't the three of us form a temporary alliance? Margot noticed that he seemed to enjoy collaborating with others. But it didn't matter. The horse fell to the ground. Chuck swung and then used fire to attack the goblins. Margot spoke out, saying that the other side was going to handle things their way, and Malcolm stated that he had known Chuck for 6 years but found it difficult to be friends with him. In that case, everyone for themselves. The goblin gazed at Chuck before taking a blow from the sword. Chuck clenched his teeth and wondered why he had not arrived yet. Then he killed the goblin and said that he had already run that far. Nay, it was unlikely. Then he looked at the two mages and explained that he had been rushing ahead of everyone since the beginning, and only these two were around. The guy stood up, realizing that he was still behind. Margot opened her mouth and heard, where is Paul? Chuck lowered his blade and questioned, why isn't it here yet? The girl said she didn't know, but it was strange. Then she introduced the goblins, explaining that they had been ahead of everyone for a long time, so why hadn't anyone, including Paul, shown up? Malkin opened her mouth, noting that it was a valid observation. There had been plenty of time to catch up with them, but nobody did. The three turned sharply and saw a cloud of dust. Paul stepped on the ground, looked at the boys, and realized he had finally caught up. Chuck strained his gaze. Margot opened her mouth and questioned, what about the rest of the participants? Paul smirked and replied that they had left. Some time ago, people were standing in the stands, shouting about why he was there. Had he actually given up? What's going on? We need to watch for now. After all, this is the magician who defeated Chuck. The protagonist stroked his head, thinking that he had been waiting for this day since he decided to participate in the great festival. He was more than confident in this competition, having exercised his endurance for more than half a year. Then he noticed the oncoming magic and explained that he was a close combat magician. If he found himself in a severely disadvantaged position with his back to the opponents behind him, he required a strategy. Paul raised his hand, looked enraged, and dashed forward, believing he was going to remove everyone one by one. The students turned around, terrified. The protagonist knocked them down by sprinting, and the other guys in the clearing assumed that, to be honest, he had already ceased counting. Paul directed his sight to the students in the air. Charlie shifted his attention, then turned to the protagonist, asking when he had time. Paul grinned and inquired whether he understood. Charlie closed his eyes and wondered whether their never-ending war had begun anew. Well, then, the protagonist apologized, then punched Charlie. Charlie was now high in the sky. Margot raised her hand, asking what he meant when he said he had eliminated everyone. Paul looked at the guy and realized that it was unlikely that anyone would try to rejoin the race. Then he opened his mouth and explained that there were no other participants at the time. Chuck clenched his teeth, turned sideways, and realized that this time would be different. The three warriors glanced at the protagonist. Chuck looked across the clearing and realized he wanted to aim his sword at him right now, but as he mentioned, other people were still pursuing them. Then he lit up with blue light and a horse materialized beneath him. The guy gritted his teeth and said they'd see each other up ahead. 9 opened his mouth and declared that he was going to push his way forward. Then he looked around the castle and mentioned that there was a trap area there. Paul peered silently ahead before introducing the spike traps, thinking that the trap region, which had previously functioned to protect the valuables, had changed. The existing traps are now used as hurdles in the competition. It's a deadly sight where recklessness can result in lethal wounds. Then he introduced the two magicians and explained that the safest and suggested approach to pass is to disable the traps first. As a result, this location serves as an excellent testing ground for magical knowledge and crisis management abilities. Paul banged on the wall and explained that disarming takes too much time. Then he raised his head, realizing that this was why he intended to smash the wall. He said that this is the method of combat. Then he stared at the top, and Ted admitted that it was true, but he couldn't break through such a thick wall. The protagonist looked to his pet and realized that these were the ruins of an abandoned castle. Ted realized he was targeting the rundown regions. Then he concentrated on specific portions of the wall, glanced down, and discovered a weak point. Paul turned and saw an old crumbling section of the wall, so he clenched his teeth and slammed the wall hard. Mousen turned around and questioned what this guy was doing. Did he want to burst through the wall? Margot stated that this was to be expected from Paul. Mosine opened her mouth and stated that she was aware that they were near, but did not believe this was excessive. Margot opened her jaws and heard him attempt to burst through the wall with his bare hands. She called for him to look, and a massive break appeared in the wall. A second later, the wall crumbled. Mosine extended his hand and exclaimed, "How was that even possible?" He then scratched his head and inquired whether he could also use that path. Paul smiled and answered, "I can't." Malin extended his hand and shouted for him to wait. Suddenly, the boulder dropped, and the guy yelled that he was greedy. Paul rushed forward, impressed that he could burst through such a formidable wall with only 2,000 strength. He connected his head and found that just he and Chuck remained. When he turned the corner, Tam opened his jaws and realized that the man had already departed the palace. Then he looked at the arrow in his back and commented that he was clearly in a hurry. He even had an arrow in his shoulder. Paul rushed ahead, reflecting on why he was so determined to defeat him. Chuck stepped onto his horse, and Paul added that the time had come to summon his spirit horse. Then he overtook Chuck and declared that he would never overtake him on a run. The man drew his sword and struck the protagonist, but missed. Paul grabbed the guy, then leaped down, noting that they would complete the final stage together. The two men began to tumble down, eventually falling into the sea. Paul emerged from the water, started swimming, and considered what worked. He would have been at a disadvantage if he had used magic to down the cliff. Instead, he needed to swim rapidly. Then he turned around to see the eye. Chuck summoned a luminous ball. The protagonist opened his mouth and exclaimed, "Actually, people swim! Why the hell is the river freezing?" Paul was trapped in the ice. Chuck looked at him and inquired if he had to worry about that during the tournament. He then smirked and stated that he would go. The protagonist cursed as he looked behind him. Then he clenched his teeth and said that he needed to get out soon. The ice began to fracture, and the protagonist broke free. Chuck jumped forward, then turned and exclaimed, "It's impossible how he caught up with him." The protagonist spotted the arena and assumed that they would soon be at Altane Stadium. There were no more barriers on the route, so he could just run. Paul grinned and jumped away from the water. Then he raised his hands and cried, "Will there ever be a match?" Chuck gritted his teeth and decided that no, in his current state. Then there was a collision. An explosion appeared on the screen. The man extended his hand and said, "Someone is approaching." Then the gates opened. The horse rushed into the ring. The spectator opened his mouth and shouted, indicating that someone was visible on the screen. The screen showed the protagonist looking at Chuck. Paul opened his mouth and stated that it appeared that he overdid it while crossing through the trap zone. The movements were somewhat uncomfortable. Then he smiled and added that, after all, wasn't he the one who advised you shouldn't think about such things during the competition? Chuck gritted his teeth. The protagonist turned around, marched straight forward, and stated that he would leave. 3 flags were hoisted across the arena. Paul stared straight forward, thinking he had won 2 awards in the survival battle and the triathlon, won the individual competition, and ultimately finished first. That was how the great festival ended for him. The audience opened their mouths and exclaimed that the next generation magician, Paul, was cool, and he assumed that many people shouted his name and began to refer to him as the next generation magician rather than a failure. Paul recalls crying and reflecting on the words said to him after 6 years of suffering in a dark cave of isolation. Then he remembered how he marched forward and said to his lonely self that he had done an excellent job. Paul placed his hand on his chest, grinned, and assumed that these encouraging screams were a reward for his hard effort. Then he lifted his hands and shouted his thankfulness, realizing that he didn't want to lose this support. The carriages were moving forwards. Jake looked out the window and stated, "There are so many of them, but they are all chosen nobles." The person mentioned that he had heard that not everyone was invited. They were here to see Paul. Paul sat at the table, looked about, then closed his eyes and realized he was bored. He wishes to return to the academy as soon as feasible, and then he opened his eyes when he heard something weird. Margot smiled at the protagonist before sitting down, hearing what was weird and responding that she was talking about individuals. They don't try to chat to him. Paul closed his eyes and realized that in their eyes, he appeared like a smud person because he arrived at the banquet dressed unenthusiastically. The girl leaned on her hand, noting that while this was obviously excluded, according to what she had heard, it was not the only reason. Paul reopened his eyes and asked again. Margot stared at the nobleman and realized that it was not an exaggeration to claim that the majority of the nobles had come here to meet him. But even though he appeared smug, how come no one has attempted to communicate with him? Then she opened her mouth and added that they said someone had staked out his position, a guy so powerful that no nobility would even consider speaking with him. Paul opened his eyes, gazed at the girl, and asked who she was. The man raised his hand and announced that they would start the evening feast. Representatives from 32 educational institutions followed him. There was expensive wine on the table. On the other hand, there was wonderful food, and the protagonist assumed that the dinner with the dirty king was filled with dishes fit for the emperor's supper. The men sat at the table, and Paul explained that the dinner was a debriefing of the competition, commonly known as the guillotine banquet, for those who had performed poorly. The protagonist glanced at the empty seats, thinking that, by the way, he expected only the nasty king to be present. But 2 places of honor were reserved. Paul froze. The man extended his hand and signaled that they were coming. Everybody at the table stood up. A man entered the room. Paul bowed and greeted the filthy king, then pondered who the heck his lord was. His fingers were cramping. Suddenly he opened his eyes, heard them pass, and pondered why the filthy king addressed someone with respect. The king extended his hand and said he hoped he hadn't disrupted their dinner. Nate looked ahead and then began to move forward. Paul opened his mouth, wondering who this man was. A moment later, everyone fell to the floor to meet the crown prince. The protagonist gritted his teeth and was terrified. Everyone sat at the table. The guy anxiously turned his attention, and one of the guys elbowed the other. Paul leaned his hand against the table. Max opened his mouth, claiming that none of the chosen 11 could overcome Paul. Was the talent difference really so large? He was disappointed and embarrassed to refer to them as his children. Chuck trembled with rage, then closed his eyes and declared that he would never present himself in a negative light again. Max closed his eyes and declared that second place was nothing but an illusion generated by unskilled individuals. The only thing this huge celebration showed was that the old saying, "A dragon can emerge even from a small stream," is accurate. Paul looked at the table and found it uncomfortable. This feast appeared to be designed to slap 11 chosen children, and he was used as a justification. But it wasn't just the nasty king who made him nervous. Then he looked at Nate and remembered the man whose eyes had burned a hole in him for so long. Nate stared at the protagonist with wild eyes. Paul remembered the emperor and believed that, despite the disadvantage of the third son, he had successfully pushed his brothers to the limit of the empire, becoming the lone crown prince. Paul stared at the guy and imagined a man with near-perfect speech and fighting skills. Then he turned his eyes, recalling Margot's statements that someone had staked out his claim, and speculated that the powerful guy the girl mentioned could be the crown prince. Max turned to the protagonist and asked how it felt to win the great festival. Paul lowered his head and then pulled it up, saying he was uncomfortable. Then he opened his mouth and stated that while he was delighted with the competition's outcomes, he was concerned that his success was being exploited to undermine and irritate the efforts of the other participants. Everybody at the table opened their lips. Paul remained cool as he gazed ahead. Max opened his mouth, recalling that he had just stated that he did not want his success to be used to anger others, and that emotions of inadequacy were the ideal sustenance for growth. You should understand that. Paul opened his mouth and stated that he perceived this as an attempt to incite anger toward. If you compare pointing out flaws and encouraging the drive to improve to instilling enmity based on emotions of inferiority, he turned and questioned if he didn't think these were completely different approaches. Then he opened his mouth and explained that he did not come from a little stream. His motherland, Ardell, was a small but magnificent place. Paul frowned and stated that the Ignat Academy where he was studying should not be dismissed as a little stream. Max opened his eyes. Max froze, staring at the protagonist. Nate opened his mouth, then raised his head and laughed out. Out, the protagonist looked at him. The Crown Prince turned around and admitted that he was a genuine pain in the ass, even snapping at his godfather. Max inquired about what he was saying. He was an interesting individual. Nate wiped away a tear and joked about splitting his stomach, which caused tears to flow. And where has he come from? People began to talk about what had happened, and they learned that he thought he came from a little stream, but he actually came from Ard, a small but lovely kingdom. Small but beautiful, so he'd like to go there at least once. Margot put her palm on her chest, happy, and then opened her mouth to ask if he would not do something like that again. Max folded his arms and remarked it was a fantastic victory speech, but he had already heard such an idealistic story from the director of his academy, so it didn't change his mind. Then he turned to the protagonist and said that his words were fresher than his own. Therefore, he was excited to see what the future held for him. Well, for today, I declare the banquet over. The guy turned around calmly, then opened his mouth, noting that he required a minute beforehand. He then rose up and mentioned that they needed to have tea with the protagonist. Then he smiled and stated that refusal would not be acceptable. Paul sat opposite Nate and leaned on his feet, wondering what the Crown Prince was trying to tell him by bringing him here. He was certainly not going to congratulate him on his victory at the great festival. He shivered when he heard his name shouted. Nate smiled and invited the protagonist to work for him. He would not take a rejection in this regard. Then he extended his hand and stated that he was giving a month to finish all of the critical matters he would arrange. Nate opened his lips to discuss his transfer to a special school for fighting mages and finding a place for him to live, noting that he would have to consider naturalization because being a foreigner was not appropriate for the Crown Prince, his closest buddy. Paul opened his mouth and inquired, why didn't the empire of countless excellent mages chuck alone? It was worthwhile. Nate closed his eyes and realized that, in the end, he was playing him as soon as his tongue turned to advise that he pick a loser. Paul gazed down, silently. The Crown Prince opened his mouth and mentioned that it was best to keep one thing in mind when speaking with him. He then opened his eyes and stated that he preferred a straightforward yes over counter questions. Paul scowled at him, lit a cigarette, and considered how he would respond. Then Max introduced himself and stated that the first factor in his decision was his godfather's personal advice. He had told him a few years ago to let him know if he came across a prospective mage, but he had yet to recommend anyone. Then he closed his eyes and said that his courage was his second favorite quality. Then he raised his hand and reflected on the courage with which he had dared that rag to meet him when everyone else was working so hard to impress the powers that be. The courage to stand up to his godfather and publicly express his case. Nate recalled how surprised everyone at the table had been. Paul looked down and realized that despite the warning, he had the bravery, bordering on recklessness, to continue asking him questions. Nate spread his hands and said that in politics, it is occasionally necessary to have someone voice an interesting point of view. Paul glanced at the Crown Prince and asked if he should only give him counsel in such scenario, to which Nate replied that once again, no, he should protect him from his damn brothers who refused to acknowledge their younger brother as Crown Prince. Paul closed his eyes. Nate glanced at him and asked if he didn't want to, and Paul said no, prompting the protagonist to lower his head and explain why he wouldn't take denial. Then he looked at Nate and assumed that the Crown Prince wielded the most power in the empire. The opportunity to become his closest comrade was 1 in a million. Hall introduced Max and explained that most mages eventually form alliances with powerful individuals, even in a magic tower where mages spend their entire lives learning magic. If he does not seize this opportunity, he may come to regret it later. Paul grinned and mentioned that there were still many things he wanted to do before concluding that, as expected, he did not want to be someone's mage. Nate grinned and said he believed he was a normal person, but he turned out to be rather idealistic. Such an opportunity comes only once in a lifetime. Wouldn't he regret it? And Paul looked up and said that it was absolutely conceivable. Nate extended his hands and commented that it was best to believe that this conversation had not occurred. Then he folded his hands and mentioned that he was dubbed the brightest jewel of the previous festival. Then he grinned and mentioned that collecting such stones was his pastime, and he had not received a single gem. Did he understand why? Paul turned and heard, because he destroys what he cannot have. He nodded to him. Then he opened the door. The protagonist leaned against the column, closed his eyes, and concluded that the Crown Prince's final remarks were clearly a threat. Whether he made the correct decision, the blonde extended his hand and called the protagonist. Jake opened his mouth to ask where he had been on a date behind their backs. Nate looked at the chandelier and said he was intrigued about the type of person he was because he had been suggested by him, and as it turned out, he was an exceptional guy in many respects. Max looked at him and remarked that their conversation did not go well, and Nate mentioned that he even threatened him, but it had no effect. Max closed his eyes and wondered if he would give in. Nate clutched the glass and replied, "Of course not. He knows him well. Nothing is stronger than his desire to acquire." Then he tightened his teeth and declared that Paul would be his since he determined so. The protagonist held out his hands. The sun rose above the mountain. The protagonist slumped back on his heels, noting that he had also finished it today. Then he fell on the grass and noticed that his body appeared to be improving with each passing day. The protagonist turned to the bear and expressed his displeasure with hearing this from another man, prompting Ted to inquire as to what he was discussing. He was a woman. Paul jumped up, asking why she was a woman, to which Ted replied that she was born this way. The bear opened her mouth and roared, "Why can they suddenly not have it?" He didn't even inquire. The protagonist remembered how they were sitting in the bee and wondered why they hadn't sat together in the bathroom. Ted said that there was something to see there. Paul opened his eyes and inquired whether, if he said so, it meant she had already seen everything. Then he grinned. He then rose up and stated that he would leave. Ted ran after him, remarking that he should wait for her, Paul said, noting that she was no longer allowed to make jokes about it. The train halted at the station. Jake hugged the protagonist and mentioned that it was time for him to leave. Let him be healthy, and Paul stated that he would not die. The train abruptly started, and the protagonist watched it leave. The person approached the protagonist and pointed out that it was time for them to leave as well. Paul sat down on a bench and realized that after his friends had gone home, he, as the winner of the great festival, needed to visit Ravon to complete all of the points on the schedule. Then he remembered the guy who said he could call him a street cat, and he reasoned that as an escort, he should accompany someone who introduced himself as one. Then he glanced at the individual and said he turned out to be a high-level magician whose qualities could not be seen with the player's eye. Paul looked at him carefully and concluded that he was at least on the same level as the Academy's instructors. He could only tell that he looked a little younger than 30. The man turned to the protagonist and stated he would simply discuss the next course of action. First, he would proceed to the Imperial Palace to receive congratulations. Then, he turned to face the protagonist and discovered that he was pleading for pardon, but it was unnecessary to talk to him formally. Paul looked at him, noticed that he was just 16, and learned that this did not inconvenience him. They would resume their schedule. The protagonist smiled, believing that he was quite scrupulous and businesslike. The man glanced at him and said that they would travel to the magic tower and select a relic for him. He then opened his mouth and said that he might go without the artifact because the object had to select him. Paul envisioned the orc and pondered whether this indicated the artifact in the tower was self-aware as like that orc. The guy reached into his bag and announced that he would finally be assigned a mission, after which he visualized the silhouette on the hill and stated that in general, due to his status as a student, he could not receive any missions, but an exception was made for the winner of the great festival. This might be seen as a notification to the world that a next generation magician has appeared. Paul looked at the paper and said it turned out to be something like a deo, after which he raised his hand, heard that they could now choose a mission from the list that he loved the most, and stated that missions included searching, subjugation, killing, and investigation. The protagonist turned to face the bear before returning his attention to the page. The train was moving swiftly, and he decided that he would like to take this one. The sun shone brightly on the hilltop palace. The man paused at the entrance and noticed that it was the Pie Palace, the Crown Prince's house. "Let me pass." Everyone was already waiting for him. He then bowed and stated that he would wait for him here, and Paul asked if he would accompany him. The doors opened abruptly. Nate glanced at the protagonist before smiling and welcoming him to his empire. Paul glanced at him solemnly before bowing and recalling that he had first earned 1,000 gold reward money from the Crown Prince. This amount exceeds the Ardell territory's annual budget. Nate sat on the throne and announced that if this wasn't enough, he could come to him at any time and change his mind. The doors to the Pay Palace were open for him, and Paul assumed that the Crown Prince had not given up on him, but he hurried on to the next thing on the agenda. The protagonist proceeded down the red carpet, remarking that the people here must have great energy, especially since they have to stroll about the castle all day. The man turned to him and told him to stop making humorous jokes. The Tower Master was waiting for him. Paul opened his mouth and said that he had no sense of humor. The person looked at him and asked if he had finally chosen to accept that mission. Paul opened his mouth and responded positively. The man walked to the door and remarked that he noticed that he had chosen the most difficult assignment. What would the Tower Master say about that? The door opened and the protagonist entered the gloomy room. Max grinned and welcomed him to the tower before staring at his tea, which indicated that he had chosen the retrieval mission. He then took up his cup and stated that the subjugation task would be easier. Paul sat down on the couch and learned that he would accompany the Imperial Army Guards to just exterminate a handful of bandit groups that had appeared near Cezanna. He would have a reputation as a hero, yet he preferred to travel to the dead wasteland. Then he looked straight ahead, convinced that it was impossible to assert there was nothing there. The protagonist turned away from the paper when he realized he needed to choose this as his first quest. Then he opened his eyes and discovered that this was Cram's homeland. Ted opened his mouth and stated that this was where the dragon had dwelt for 100 years. The dragon was sitting in a clearing. The protagonist pictured a mountain in a remote country to the north of the kingdom, Radion, where ancient orcs were said to reside. Then he pictured orcs, but no orcs now reside there since. In addition to the living artifact at the academy, Kingra. Then he envisioned a demon and mentioned that the rest of the race had perished in the Great War. Paul imagined a skull and observed in his mind that the area had become a lifeless desert of orcish absence. The reason the search mission in that location was awarded the highest difficulty rating was due to the barrier. Then he recalled Sharp Mountain. He then pictured 3 mages and believed there was a barrier that could not be broken by any spell. Until recently, no scientist or mage has been able to solve the mystery of Heavenly Mountain's barrier. This aim was to discover the essence of the barrier. Paul glanced straight ahead and was asked why he was interested in visiting the wasteland, where there was nothing. Max folded his arms and said that he would be interested in the theory that the wrath of the orcish god had transformed that location into a sanctuary. Paul stared straight ahead, thinking that others had no reason to go there, but Dragonia, the destroyer of worlds, had resided there for a century. Then he visualized a dragon and stated that this was enough. The protagonist looked at the man and saw that this mission was the most challenging. Max suggested that if that was it, he should choose another task. Then he showed a lock with a chain and said that the reason for the increased difficulty was not the excessive activity, but the enigma that no one had been able to completely understand. Paul grinned and said that if a 16-year-old magician had solved the enigma, wouldn't this feat be even more impressive? Max leaned on his hand, saying that either he would become the first great festival champion in history to fail the mission, or Paul would point out that it was too soon to rule out an amazing accomplishment. Max gazed at him quietly. Paul appeared shocked when asked why he had suggested him to the Crown Prince. Max opened his mouth and stated that he intended to leave him in Ravan to watch him. Paul gazed at him quietly. Max tucked his hands under the table and explained that his special skill was not the reason for the increased interest in this assignment. Max clenched his teeth and decided that no matter what, he would watch. Paul gazed at him hesitantly. The protagonist laid on the bed, wondering if, despite his claims of coping, everything would actually work out. Ted inquired, concerned that he would not be able to receive anything. Then he opened his mouth and stated that there was little, as the location had not been visited in several hundred years. Will he be able to learn anything after so much time? Ted glanced at him and explained that until now, no one had been able to discover anything in a humane manner, but he would. Chuck stated that he was also a person. Ted gazed up at the ceiling and claimed that he possessed powers that exceeded human capacities. The protagonist stood up after hearing a knock and a voice saying it was him, Bokeh, and replied that he could leave. He then looked at the two men and greeted them. Ted stared at him and inquired what he was talking about. He said that they said it was the nasty king's preferences. All of the mages in the magic tower have similar addresses. The guy grinned and inquired whether it was time for them. Then he extended his hand and announced that he was going to the artifact room to accept his final gift. The three continued along the hallway, explaining that the magic tower's artifact room was divided into 4 zones.